Virginia didn't see the bus stop right away. She dozed off, though she did not sleep very soundly and controlled the situation, from time to time checking with her hand the son sitting next to her. However, if it hadn't been for the driver stopping the bus at the right place, she probably would have moved on. But here we are. "Why are there missing letters in the name of the bus stop?" Alex asked doubtfully. "I don't know, son. The paint must have peeled off," Virginia smiled. "It's a pine tree." The boy laughed. "That's it. Because I read it. It says Sofka of some kind." Virginia took the bulky suitcases in her hands and went to the exit. Her son tried to help, but it was of little use. 7 years old. What kind of strength is that? He was as thin as a reed. The driver looked at the strange couple and caught himself thinking that this trip was not easy for him. The woman doctor and her son were already walking toward the village. The houses were not too far from the main highway. The driver smiled, started the engine. "They are strange. You can tell they're from the city." A young woman in plain, everyday clothes and a boy in a yellow jacket, noticeable from afar. Virginia drove, almost to nowhere, leaving behind the intrigues of an unfaithful husband and traitorous colleagues. Within the walls of the therapeutic department, nothing will get through. It's not easy for everyone now, and it has always been so. The main thing, to find the strength to live on, like an incantation in her head. Virginia sneaked away from her son. She took her wedding ring off her finger and tossed it into the bushes. She wanted nothing to do with Jonathan. No rings, no money, no jewelry. Soon the first buildings showed, and the air smelled of fragrant smoke. Either a fire or a stove someone was heating with dry kindling for the night. Spring is a special time. The sun warms up during the day, but at night the house is chilly, especially for the elderly and children. Virginia got permission to move into a vacant house from a local farmer, who was considered a sort of chairman in the village. Brandon frowned when he saw a young woman and a boy of about 7. He knew from the look of the guests that they had come from the city, suitcase in hand. They were not dressed for the provinces. "Uncle, will you give us a house to sleep in?" begged the boy. The farmer looked at his mother in amazement. "Do you really need a place to stay?" Virginia nodded and added quietly, "Yes, I do, at least for the first time. And then I'll get a job and we can pay the rent. I'm actually a doctor by trade, a therapist." Brandon shook his head. "I don't need any money. I'm not a human being, am I? Besides, there are enough empty houses. People don't want to work the land. So people have gone to the city, and some of them have simply passed away because of age, leaving no heirs. So the houses are empty. Even vagrants don't want to move in. I don't blame them, though. Life in our village is not honey." "Thank you very much," said Virginia with feeling. The farmer paused for a moment, then said, "Why don't I give you the keys to Kevin's house? Yeah, it's been empty for, like 5 years. No heirs, no new owners. That's the way it is around here. About a third of the houses in the village are abandoned, which means that if left unattended, they risk soon turning into ruins. So you're welcome to live your life. And the fact that you're a doctor, it's good. We need good specialists, oh, so much. Come on, let's go. Let me lift your suitcase so it's closer." Virginia nodded. What else could she say? Evening was coming. It wouldn't be long before dark. She and her son couldn't spend the night in the open air. They're not vagabonds after all. And following the elderly farmer, Alex turned around and quietly asked, "Mom, are we going to live with wolves? I thought they were only in the forest. Well, they chase hares or deer. But what if they bite?" Mom almost dropped the second suitcase out of her hands in amazement. "What wolves, son? What are you talking about?" "That's Kevin's last name. What's yours?" "Virginia." Alex looked at his mother doubtfully. "Well, yes, I'm Virginia, but these Kevins, they give me the creeps." The farmer ahead of him chuckled. "Well, don't worry, buddy. There ain't no wolves out there. The local agronomist used to live there. He was old and had lost his wife. He left early, poor guy. But he had a nice house. Kevin's hands were golden, always making things. Virginia nodded understandingly. In truth, she was anxious to get into the house and catch her breath, having been on her feet and on the road all day. Finally, they came to the right place. Brandon handed her the keys and wished her a good evening. "If you have any problems, you can come to me right away. I'm kind of the last resort around here. The district center is far away. People are always in trouble, so I help out a little bit." "All right, thank you," said Virginia, and waved goodbye to the kind farmer. To her great surprise, the lock on the door yielded almost immediately. Lubricated, I suppose, but it couldn't have been kept in that condition for 5 years, could it? Virginia thought as she dragged the suitcase in. Alex, who had come in after her, suddenly froze in the living room like a stumbling block. "Is something wrong, son?" Virginia asked anxiously. The little boy looked at his mother. "It smells like food. Something cooking. Frying, maybe." Virginia shook her head doubtfully. "Michelle, you say cooking too. Who could cook here?" But Alex didn't hear her anymore, because he immediately ran to the kitchen, from where he brought a frying pan with some oil on it. "Mom, look what I said. It's still warm." Virginia turned pale and immediately looked around the room. No one seemed to be there. But who was cooking on the old electric stove? "Son, please come to me. Don't go to the other rooms, do you hear?" With a shimmying voice, said Virginia. She looked around for something suitable for self-defense. There was nothing but an old rolling pin, cracked in several places. But all right, in case of trouble, it would be a good defense, Virginia thought, listening to every rustle. At that moment, Alex's joyful cries came from the far room. "Mommy, and here Uncle Houseboy is sitting." "What housekeeper?" Scarlett asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "The real one, the one with the beard," Virginia replied, still clutching the rolling pin in her hand. She entered the room from which her son's voice was coming, and almost immediately saw an unshaven man in his mid-30s. The stranger's look of embarrassment was obvious. "I'm sorry, please, it's not what you think. I'm not a thief. Not at all. It just happened." Still clutching the rolling pin, Virginia mumbled embarrassedly. "I didn't mean anything by it. Who are you, anyway?" Virginia's question definitely took the guest by surprise. The man hesitated for a moment, then said, "I am the owner of this house. I inherited it. I have the papers, so I decided to move in." Virginia's surprise made her uncomfortable. Move in? Why did he act like a thief and look like a vagrant? On the other hand, if the man's papers were in order, then Virginia wasn't here legally. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I'm sorry, we'll be leaving now," she mumbled embarrassedly. The stranger immediately replied with a firm refusal. "No, don't go. The house is big, there's plenty of room for everyone. Yes, I have not yet decided whether I will live here or not. Anyway, let's get acquainted. I'm Leslie." Thank you. That's very kind of you. And I'm Virginia. This is my son, Alex," she said. "Well, I guess we'll get to know each other. You know, I was worried when I heard voices in the house. I thought maybe they were burglars," Leslie said with relief. Virginia smiled, and Alex immediately noticed. "Are you sure you're not a houseboy? You have a different last name. The farmer said Kevin lived here. And you are Brown?" Leslie froze in surprise. It was obvious from his face that he didn't know what to say to the boy. Luckily, his mother came to the rescue and noticed. "Well, you can't hide anything from you, Alex. You catch everything on the fly. Well, sit down at the table. Now we'll have something to eat." Leslie smiled. "And I have pancakes, though, from plain flour and on water but warm still. Would you like some?" Virginia looked at him with respect. "You're a master of all trades. It is rare to meet a man who knows how to fry pancakes, even with simple flour and water." Virginia's voice was clearly unconcealed irony, and he immediately felt it. However, Leslie did not take offense. And in a couple of minutes, all three of them sat at the table and ate what God had sent. And the owner of the house served sandwiches, which Virginia had taken with her on the road. They boiled a kettle on an old electric stove. And soon the room was filled with a divine aroma. Virginia had taken tea with her, too, only in bags. Leslie behaved modestly at the table, as if embarrassed by the presence of guests. At the same time, Virginia could not help noticing that in his voice from time to time there were notes of sadness. Of course, Virginia realized that Leslie's appearance in the village looked strange. He came, said nothing to anyone. Living a reclusive life, though, according to his own words, the rightful heir. But then Virginia remembered her own problems and immediately realized that she had no right to judge this man, since she herself had come here as a doctor who had lost her job because of her cheating husband. She took a sip of the fragrant tea. Virginia sank unnoticed into her memories. Most of them were painful and left a fresh wound in her soul after the betrayal of her husband Jonathan. She had decided to go, no matter what. There was something in the doctor's character that gave her the right to do sometimes very reckless and unpredictable things. Having lost her job due to her husband's illness, she planned nothing. She was ready to go nowhere. She just opened up a map and figured out a rough route. "But we are far away, so Dad won't find us," Alex asked on the way to the bus station. Virginia, mentally surprised by her son's insight, replied with a smile, "I can't hide anything from you. Little hero. Yes, we're leaving. I want to find such a place, so that the forest and the river were nearby, and so that my dad would never find us there." Alex nodded understandingly. After yesterday's quarrel between his parents, he realized that they would never be able to live together. Von Dad took such a swing at Mom and wasn't even ashamed of his presence. Well, not hit, but threatened, as he had done many times before. Mom was just hiding and crying quietly in the room, thinking he couldn't hear. Alex stood between his parents then, protecting his mom first and foremost. Tears glistened in Virginia's eyes. She hugged her son tightly, saying with a look that she would do everything she could to make sure he didn't need anything. Now, rushing to the bus with her heavy suitcases, she thought only of her son, of the peace and balance that would finally be restored to his life. An unpleasant surprise awaited her at the bus station. There were no tickets for the desired direction. Or rather, there were, but only for the next flight, which was planned only in the evening, and to go into the unknown, and even under the cover of darkness, so not a good thing, especially when you have a young child with you. "Mom, what are we going to do now? Are we going to go back?" Alex asked sadly. Her son's question caught her by surprise. What did she really hope for, if she was chaotically raking things into suitcases, and decided to leave her unfaithful husband? "No, son, we'll think of something else. We're definitely not going back," Virginia replied in a shaky voice. In her hind mind, she realized that she had done a rash thing. She would have lived in the trader's house for a while longer, or rented an apartment. She would have waited for a divorce, and then she'd be free to go. But no, she left on emotion, without thinking about anything. Although there was a reason for this, and quite a good reason, what could she do when, returning from work a little early, caught her husband in bed with his own colleague Olivia, daughter of the head doctor and the first candidate for her imminent promotion to head of the therapy department? And what a cheeky bastard Jonathan was, eh? He's only half an hour early. He timed it to the minute. I wanted to make a nice dinner. I bought groceries, a bottle of wine, candles. But what without them? Alex's son was just at his prep class. I mean, the tutor didn't pick him up until an hour later. I needed something like this. The first thing that caught Virginia's eye was the woman's high-heeled shoes standing in the hallway, and also the soft music of a quiet timbre, which was clearly aimed at creating the right romantic atmosphere. Still clutching the grocery bag, Virginia headed for the bedroom. She'd rather not do that, leaving her imagination to paint it all as it was. In the bed, Jonathan and Olivia lay in each other's arms. Virginia dropped the grocery bag from her hands in surprise. The bottle of wine at the bottom of the bag shattered. A dark red stain slowly spread across the yellow carpet Virginia had bought a couple days ago. "What have you done, you fool?" "It cost half your salary," Jonathan exclaimed, not the least bit embarrassed by the piquancy of the situation. She felt uncomfortable with the insolence. He pulled the blanket up to Olivia's chin. She looked up at him with a look of triumph. A tear trickled down Virginia's cheek. "Aren't you ashamed of yourselves? Can't you meet somewhere else? It's so disgusting. I can't say it enough." "Well, darling, I guess we couldn't. What's your problem? You've neglected your man." You don't pay attention to him. What do you look like now? A scarecrow. No hair, no makeup, and your lipstick is as pale as a marshmallow, Jonathan said, recovering from the initial shock. And Olivia, realizing that she had nothing more to say to the traitors, Virginia left the house and went to pick up her son. She and Alex spent the night at a hotel. The next morning, Virginia found out she was fired. Yes, just like that, under false pretenses. Naturally, in this case clearly did not do without the help of the head Dr. Peter, who decided to protect his daughter from possible meetings with Virginia. As could be expected, no one cared about the moral side of the issue. Well, Olivia had found herself a new suitor. Let them play. She'd been married 3 times already, so it wouldn't be the first or the last, as they say. Virginia was accused of abuse and bribery in the workplace, although many nurses and orderlies understood everything perfectly well. What kind of bribes can a doctor take? Ridiculous. Especially Virginia, who had a heart for her patients, would always come up, ask how they were doing, talk to them. She'd give each one a little bit of time. The reprimand from the bosses and the subsequent dismissal Virginia endured firmly. Not a tear in her eye gave the scoundrels. Let them live on, reveling in their power. Virginia knew sooner or later retribution would come upon all the guilty, and if not, the higher powers will reward everyone according to their deeds and actions. Having received the settlement, Virginia packed her things and together with Alex went to the station. Only there were no tickets. How could she have miscalculated? Standing at the ticket office, Virginia painfully searched for a way out of the situation. Alex was hanging around in his yellow jacket. You look at him from the outside and involuntarily hold your gaze, as if at a little sun bunny, flitting back and forth. And where do small children get so much energy? Spring came early this year, and it was really warm. It was easy on the soul. And if it hadn't been for Jonathan's dastardly deed, things would have been pretty good. Virginia was brought out of her sad thoughts by a quiet male voice. Pardon me, but are you going toward Pineville by any chance? Virginia turned around and saw in front of her a rather nice man of about 50 years old with a small belly, a characteristic vest with many pockets and a cap on his head. Virginia smiled, guessing it was the bus driver. They all dressed in much the same way, to be practical and comfortable on the road. Yes, you're right. I need this particular destination, but the next flights don't leave until 8 p.m. And the one leaving now is already sold out, Virginia complained. The chauffeur nodded sympathetically and then deliberately lowered his voice and said, And this is my route. Do you understand? The bus leaves in 10 minutes. Virginia looked at him with bewilderment. Why did she need this information? There are no tickets anyway. I can guess what you're thinking at this moment, he continued. Look, what if I help you out? Yeah, there are no seats available. But today I'm traveling alone, without a helper, which means his seat is available. Your son can easily sit there, and you can sit on the suitcase for a few stops until the seat becomes available. Yeah, I agree. It's not much service, but I can't think of anything better. Virginia thought about it. Why don't she just go for it? So what if she had to ride in a suitcase? It's no big deal. She's not royalty. Thank you. I'll do it. Shall I give you the fare now? She asked, embarrassed. The driver immediately waved his hands in protest. No, not at all. Do not even talk about it. I want to help not because of money. I just felt sorry for him. It's your son. Virginia smiled. Yes, Alex is going to school next year. We wanted to do it this year, but we changed our minds. He's still young. The driver smiled. I see. I have 3 daughters. I always wanted a son. I love them with all my heart. All right, here's the deal. Wait for me at that corner. You see that cafeteria with the yellow sign? Stay right there. Thank you very much, Virginia said with feeling. Alex heard the conversation by ear, and his mood improved. After he looked at the departing chauffeur, he asked, Mom, am I going to ride right next to the driver? Yes, son. That's right. Alex's eyes lit up with joy. Wow. That's great. Mom, won't he let you drive? Just a little bit. I won't go fast, I promise, said Alex. Virginia smiled. You're a real piece of work, buddy. What bus do you need? You should learn to ride a bicycle first, and then you'll finish school and you'll be able to realize your dream. Okay, let's go to that cafe over there. They'll pick us up. Alex followed his mom disappointedly and obediently. Virginia, bending under the weight of 2 suitcases, slowly walked to the place indicated by the driver. At the same time, she realized that their new acquaintance had purposely done so in order not to have problems with the inspectors. It was hard to carry the suitcases, but indifferent passers-by walked by, as if not noticing her difficulties. Fortunately, the walk was not far, and in 5 minutes the driver, as promised, picked them up at the turn. The bus was brand new, and it was bright green with orange stripes on the sides. It was cool and pleasant inside. It smelled of air freshener. Taking a seat next to the chauffeur, Alex began to watch the road with all his eyes. Virginia sat down on the suitcases at the end of the cabin, deciding not to put them in the luggage compartment. It was more comfortable that way, and the chair was always close by. As Alex found out, the driver's name was Aiden. Kind and sociable, he was a big fan of fishing and could talk about it for hours. Alex listened to him with wide open eyes as if mesmerized. Watching her son from afar, Virginia caught herself thinking that she had made the trip for a reason. What else was there to do? Wait for her husband to file for divorce. It wasn't particularly pleasant, to say the least. Scarlett could hardly get a job in her hometown, either, because Olivia's father had done everything possible to prevent that from happening. When calculating, the head doctor did not forget to remind the former subordinate about the wolf ticket, which he awarded her on occasion. Of course, Virginia did not regret anything, except the lost time, but it was necessary to change the city, especially when the most important thing for her was always her son Alex. For his sake, she was ready to do anything, so she dared to go to the wilderness to provide her son, if not rich, at least a quiet childhood. With Jonathan, however, there was no peace at all. Daily quarrels, discontent, arguments, scolding, breaking dishes, and accusations that had no basis in fact. But in the beginning, even before the wedding, Jonathan was quite different, attentive, gave flowers, gifts, took them to restaurants, and generally did everything that a wealthy man should do at the beginning of a relationship. Virginia grew up in a poor family, never knew luxury. No, this did not mean that she lived in poverty and donated clothes for her older brothers and sisters. Just in some matters, Virginia's parents tried to save an extra penny so that it will be useful to them in the future. In fact, Virginia grew up to be just as thrifty, careful, and frugal. However, in relations with her husband, these qualities were not useful at all. Jonathan loved the beautiful life, expensive cars, and equally beautiful women. Virginia was endowed with the very beauty which is called natural, without artificial eyelashes, unnecessary, and other adjustments. However, she herself to such manipulations treated with understanding, because she believed that any woman has the right to freedom. If she wanted to radically change her appearance, who could prevent her from doing so? Her acquaintances had been whispering about Jonathan cheating on her for a long time, but she didn't believe it. As was often the case, she was among the last to be convinced of the truth of the rumor. Jonathan was not considered a wealthy man in the city. His business was more of an average income, and not everyone could call him a rich man. Pamela's friend advised her to consult a family lawyer before she left to clarify the situation and what to do next. But Virginia only brushed it off. I don't want any lawyers' courts proceedings. I think that all this will pass without me. Moreover, the court is obliged to award Jonathan alimony, and I don't want to cross him again. Pamela shook her head. It's up to you, Virginia. But I'd be on the safe side. I'd make inquiries about what's legally due and what I can expect to get when I divide the property. You never know. Virginia shook her head negatively. But what kind of division of property? Jonathan bought the house on credit. Yes, we lived together then and paid it off too. But the property is in his name. Jonathan said so, and I didn't mind. You know, I'm used to trusting people. Pamela said ironically, you trusted them, and now you're getting thanks. This conversation took place shortly before they left for the unknown village. Naturally, Virginia realized that she would not be unemployed, because doctors are needed everywhere. She did not consider herself a bad specialist and realized that luck would definitely smile on her sooner or later in all 32. They were already on the road for about an hour when Alex suddenly looked at his mom anxiously. "Son, is something wrong?" she asked. The boy shrugged his shoulders in an inarticulate way and then pointed his finger at the driver. Virginia looked over and was stunned to see that the man behind the wheel, Walter, had a grimace of pain on his face as he tried to reach up to unbutton his shirt collar. His breathing was ragged and noisy, and sweat was pouring from his forehead. Virginia didn't have to be an idiot to guess that he had obvious heart trouble. She jumped out of her seat and paced the saloon. At the same time, the driver, realizing what his condition could bring him to, stopped the bus on the side of the road. At the same moment, it fell on its side with an unpleasant creaking sound. The passengers spoke excitedly, still not realizing what had happened. Some of them thought the driver was drunk, and of course that was a grave mistake. Virginia had personally spoken to Aiden and saw that he certainly showed no signs of intoxication. "Help me put him on his back," the doctor ordered sharply. At the same moment, some full-figured lady with a dog in her arms noticed. "You're in charge here. And who are you? You should call an ambulance, not amateurize." The passenger's words definitely made sense. But on the other hand, while the ambulance would still arrive, and Virginia was going to give the driver the very necessary help, which could solve a lot of things. "Calm down, please. I'm a doctor. Help me get the man out and put him on a hard surface. And then step aside and sit quietly, please," Virginia said, as she had done so many times in the therapy department, where the nurses and orderlies obeyed her without question. The lady with the dog muttered something to herself. However, she did not comment on Virginia's remarks, but quickly went to her pocket for the phone to call an ambulance. Virginia at that moment started resuscitation. She quickly determined from circumstantial signs that the driver had gone into cardiac arrest. Alex had never seen his mom so determined and focused in his life. While giving the victim indirect cardiac massage, Virginia put a part of her own strength and inner energy into each push. From the outside, it looked like some mysterious ritual, the conditions of which not everyone could know. A push. Another one. A small gap. Another push. Following a certain rhythm, Virginia tearfully tried to resuscitate the man. Since his condition was still critical, at some point it seemed to Virginia that she could not save him, and therefore everything she was doing was useless. Tears were streaming down the doctor's cheeks as she realized with each push that it was probably no longer possible to bring the driver back to life. And when she once again pushed the man in the chest with force, he suddenly wheezed a little audibly and then wiggled his fingers. "Look, alive, alive. Good people, look, she is a real sorceress," the lady with the dog exclaimed in amazement, causing her little dog to yap loudly, making everyone present smile in relief. Virginia, who for the first time in her life had resuscitated a man under such conditions, literally bringing him back from the dead, was also smiling. From the intense tension and shock, her hands were shaking and tears were flowing down her cheeks. And all this against the background of a joyful smile from the fact that she managed to do the impossible. 5 minutes later, the ambulance showed up. The staff loaded the driver onto a stretcher and carried him to the intensive care vehicle. Their Aiden was placed on an IV and put on an oxygen mask. Virginia, on the other hand, did not regain consciousness immediately. For some time, the bus stood on the side of the road, waiting for a substitute, a driver who came in his own car to drive and bring him to place his colleague. All this time, people looked respectfully at their accidental traveling companion, who, as if by the will of Providence, was on the bus with them. As they were saying goodbye, the ambulance paramedic remarked to Virginia, "I, of course, do not judge, but I think he will live. I see you did a good job of resuscitating him. It's just like you said it would be. Eyewitnesses told me that you kept the right rhythm and the right amount of pressure. You have nothing to do with medicine?" Virginia smiled. "Yes. I'm a general practitioner. But this is the first time. You know, it's not part of my regular duties. And today, I guess it was a coincidence. The paramedic looked at her with respect. That's a nice coincidence, I can't say. But you did it perfectly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been in the parlor. And that patient will live. But he'll retire. And he won't be able to work on a bus anymore. But that's okay, he'll find something easier. Money is money, but you can't buy health. Virginia nodded in agreement and then went to her seat. After sitting down on the suitcase, the driver soon arrived and the bus set off again. Thankfully, the rest of the journey passed without incident. After that, mother and son got off at the stop and went to a remote village where they planned to rent a house. All of this flew before Virginia's eyes in just a minute. Although, in fact, stretched before that for days, hours, and months. As if realizing what his new acquaintance was going through, Leslie sat silent and looked at one point. Finally, waking up from her thoughts, Virginia shook her head and looked at the man sitting next to her. I'm sorry I've been so down. I've had so much on my mind. My head is spinning. I feel like I've lived my whole life these past few days. It's been so full, Virginia said. Leslie smiled. Yes, I understand. I had something similar too. A little earlier, though. Virginia nodded understandingly. She liked her new acquaintance more and more. Leslie was calm, didn't ask too many questions. He listened to everything she said and did not interrupt. And after dinner, they decided to choose rooms for the night. Of course, Leslie did not make any hint of coexistence and agreed to sleep in the far room by the window. Virginia, on the other hand, chose a room nearer the exit. First, it was the cleanest, and second, it had 2 small beds, which was convenient for her son's rest. Despite being very tired before going to bed, Virginia quickly wiped the floor with a damp cloth, shook out the sheets and blanket. After that, she put Alex to bed and lay in bed for a long time, thinking about what to do next. She wanted to find a job in the district center because doctors were obviously not needed in the village. She did not want to do something else because she considered her vocation to be medicine and nothing else. Virginia was able to sleep only after midnight, when the moon, which looked like a huge orange, colored everything in bizarre purple tones. Unfortunately, Virginia didn't get a good night's sleep that night, because after an hour she woke up to loud screams, not realizing what was going on. She jumped out of bed and tiptoed to the door. At first, she didn't even realize what was going on, as she heard only an incoherent set of words spoken by a stranger. But when Virginia listened more closely, she realized that it was probably her new acquaintance Leslie screaming in his sleep. Virginia opened the door and took a few steps toward his room. Now she could make out something else. No, you don't have to. It's not my fault. You hear me? Don't take the restaurant away from me. I didn't do it. I'm not a criminal. You hear me? Get me a lawyer. Seeing the sweater of the delirious man in the corner, Virginia realized that he was having a nightmare. Without further ado, she walked over to Leslie and gently placed her palm on his heated forehead. He shuddered and, without opening his eyes, rolled over onto his other side, gradually calming down. Of course, Virginia understood he had had an unusual dream, and there was nothing special about it. On the other hand, in his vision, Leslie had talked about some strange things connected with crime in the restaurant. But what exactly did he mean? Virginia never understood, deciding to find out under more favorable circumstances, and went to bed. It is worth saying that Leslie behaved quietly the rest of the night, and in the morning he woke up happy and full of energy. Well, now I'll drink tea and clean up the yard. I'll scythe on the fence. And the gate should be renewed, because it squeaks like a distressed violin, he said. Virginia looked at him with interest. But I'll organize the cleaning of the house, if that's the case. And then I'll go to Farmer Brandon's to look for another place to live. Leslie looked anxiously at his guest. Are you leaving? I thought you'd stay. There's plenty of room, and I'm not bothering you. 1 room is enough for me. It's fine. As if looking for support, Virginia looked at her son. Alex shrugged his shoulders and then said, Mom, let's live here some more. I liked it at Uncle Leslie's. He knows a lot of fairy tales and stories, and he cooks deliciously. Virginia smiled. Then, hearing about the cooking, she decided to ask the question she had wanted to ask the night before, while Leslie was asleep. It was just a shame that the timing wasn't right, but now she could finally voice it out loud. "Listen, Leslie, I do not mind, of course, to live in your house for a while, but there's just one thing that's bothering me. Tell me, please, do you often have nightmares at night?" He shuddered and looked at Virginia in surprise. "No, not often, I don't think. Why do you ask?" Virginia shook her head. "The thing is, at night I heard you yelling and using words that I didn't like very much, about restaurants and something else to do with imprisonment." These words made Leslie uncomfortable. Virginia already mentally regretted that she had voiced it. The man literally collapsed and lowered his eyes guiltily. "I'm sorry. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't dare. The dreams I've been having are not accidental. You see, the thing is, I'm an ex-convict." Virginia dropped her spoon from her hands in surprise, and it rolled on the table with a melodious clinking sound. "So you have a criminal record. Why didn't you tell me that right away?" Leslie turned pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "I'm sorry, I was just afraid I'd scare you. Don't think I'm not a murderer or a maniac. In fact, I used to be a businessman who owned a restaurant downtown. But 5 years ago, I was framed, accused of a crime I didn't commit. Turns out my place was doing double bookkeeping. There was also money laundering. But you probably know what I'm talking about. I didn't know who was doing it. Maybe it was my partner or something, and I was the one who got caught up in it, so it was all on me. So I went away for 5 years without parole." Virginia listened and could not believe her ears. Can this really happen in life? The only man who seemed pleasant to her turned out to be an ex-convict with a certificate of release in hand. On the other hand, she had no right to accuse Leslie. Was he telling the truth or not? Still, he had shown hospitality, had not chased them away late at night, putting them out on the street, taking himself in hand. Virginia said, "I apologize for being abrupt. That's all right. In fact, if it's all right, let's go completely you. Just do not think it does not oblige to anything. It's just easier. I feel like an old man, honestly." Virginia nodded. "Okay, I don't mind." There was a tense pause in the room for a moment, threatening to turn into an oppressive silence. Fortunately, Alex diffused the situation in time. "So you were rich, Uncle Leslie? Like my dad, or even richer?" "No, more like wealthy," Leslie waved away embarrassedly. The boy listened to the former businessman so attentively, as if he was on the same wavelength with him. But the son still did not get around to one question. "Did you have children, Uncle Leslie? You know, a daughter or son? If not, you can have me. Sure, my daddy gave me up and drove me and my mommy away. So I'm ready to be your son." Virginia almost choked on her tea in surprise. "What are you talking about, my friend? What son? Why are you embarrassing us, Alex?" Leslie waved his hands in protest. Wait a minute. Nobody's embarrassing anybody. It's okay. I'm a reasonable person. I understand everything. The child, after all, what he thinks, what he says." Virginia smiled. She liked that approach. It was not like Jonathan, who criticized his son for no reason at all. At the same time, he repeatedly told her that Alex might not be his own. "Look, you even have the same hair, dark. Do you think I'm capable of cheating?" Jonathan only waved his wife away like a pesky fly. "But whether you are capable of it or not, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. I know she cheated. I'll send you and Alex away, and I won't care if you have my last name." Thinking about it now, Virginia proudly thought, "Yes, who would talk about cheating? And what did you do?" "The thief's head is on fire. Threw them out into the street like weak kittens." After thinking for a while, Virginia asked a question that worried her as much as Leslie's past. "Listen, how come this agronomist, well, the tenant formerly, made a will for you? Is he related to you?" Leslie shook his head incomprehensibly. "I wish I'd known, Virginia. I'd just gotten out of prison. And then the notary found me, came up, introduced himself, and said that I was bequeathed the house." "Who did?" I don't know. I don't know the name at all. Kevin. So what? I haven't exactly had the easiest life, you know. I grew up in an orphanage as a kid, and then when I got out, I went to school and got a part-time job. In general, my business cost me the most expensive price. Virginia nodded. Yes, I believe that. There are a lot of cases like that in life. People think that everything in business is simple and straightforward, but it really isn't. My husband Jonathan was in business too, and then he ended up in bed with my coworker. It's like that. That's what he told me about business negotiations, commerce. I was a fool to believe in hope. Deciding to change the unpleasant topic, Leslie asked. Virginia, and in general, what do you think to do next? To be honest, I don't know what to do in my life. I think to the farmer to go to the bow. Maybe he'll take it. Virginia smiled. Of all the prisoners she had seen in her life, Leslie was the most responsible and calm. He seemed recently released, but he was already looking for work, not idling or thinking about how to live at the expense of others. I don't know where to go yet. I'll probably go to the district hospital or the emergency room. Therapists are needed everywhere, said Virginia. Then Leslie immediately realized that the conversation was over and did not continue it, and instead went to the yard to fight weeds, fix fences, and lubricate rusty gate awnings. Needless to say, how surprised the locals were to see such a lively bustle in the abandoned house. Just yesterday it was empty and showed no signs of life. And today there were men, women, and even a child. It was a big surprise to Brandon, too. As he approached the house, he asked Leslie who he was and on what grounds he had moved in. But when Leslie showed him the necessary papers, the farmer scratched his head thoughtfully. What a lot of things can happen. How did that agronomist Kevin leave you such an inheritance? You're good too. Why didn't you move in right away? Why did you wait all these years? What if I'd given the house to someone else? Leslie hesitated, not wanting to talk about the fact that he'd been behind bars for 5 years. Fortunately, Virginia came to the rescue in time and began to talk about how she liked her new place. Well, I'm glad to help. I was told about you right away, Virginia. How you saved that driver with the heart on the highway. People told me about it, and they cried. And you've given me back my faith in good things by your example. So live as long as you want, but as long as Leslie doesn't mind. The landlord smiled. No, what's the big deal? It's fine. On the contrary, I would like to ask you for work. I'm not a lazy guy. I grew up in an orphanage, so I know what a pound of flesh is worth. You know, you say, said the farmer thoughtfully, and then added, well, I think I can help. It's hard work, though. I warn you right away. I'll work in the stables. I have a small herd there, you know. Well, I keep it for myself, for my soul, so to speak. Sometimes I give rides to the local kids. And in general, I dream of opening a boarding house so that people can rest here, be treated. Those with injuries of the musculoskeletal apparatus, they can ride horses, feed them, take care of them. So, if you want, come to me at any time. I'll find work. I won't hurt you with money. It's not gold, of course, but you won't go hungry. Plus, I'll give you some food for free. A dreamy smile played on Leslie's lips. Thank you. I've wanted to connect my life with the countryside for a long time. I've never been able to do so. The former businessman's confession sounded so sincere that Virginia began to mentally scold herself for allowing herself to doubt him. At the same time, a few kilometers away from this place, Jonathan was talking to his girlfriend Olivia. And if the businessman tried to avoid the topic of the wedding and the upcoming life together, Olivia cared only about it. Look, Jonathan, how long are you going to drag this divorce out? Especially once it's all cleared up. I'm rid of the competition. What's stopping us from living together, she asked. He frowned. On the face of the businessman was evident that such a question was very unpleasant to him. What's not in a hurry? What's not in a hurry, you know? The division of property awaits me, alimony. Again, with the amount of my income, the payments for the child will be very large and will hit our budget, he said. Olivia just waved him off. Come on, it's going to hit our budget too. In case you've forgotten, my father's the chief of medicine, so we're not going to starve. And we'll deal with Virginia. We'll figure something out. Jonathan looked intently into his mistress's eyes. We'll think of something. What can we think of? There's nothing we can do. Only alimony and division of property. The law. Olivia smiled meaningfully. You're just like a little kid. There are other ways to go about it. Unless, of course, you're completely brain dead. What's that? One solution to your problems with Virginia. Alex will live with you. That means you won't have to pay him alimony. And property division could be avoided. Jonathan liked the idea immediately. But how could he make it work? Seeing the question frozen in the eyes of the businessman, the mistress continued. What are you looking at? I'm right. Believe me, I know a lot about these things. We'll deal with your Virginia first. Where did she go? She's probably in the middle of nowhere. I know her. She's like an ostrich with her head in the sand. In that case, I'd be in the center of town, out in the open. She's probably in some village or other. What's that got to do with us? Jonathan didn't understand. So, while she's hiding there, we'll use the guardianship service to make it look like your wife can't provide her son with good conditions, and then we'll terminate her parental rights on that basis. So you have to use your head. Jonathan's eyes flashed with joy. You're really something, Olivia. And I thought that you were. You're the best at what you do. I admire your talents. Olivia smiled. So you had your doubts. Don't be flattered. I told you I'd find a way. And you didn't believe me. After this conversation, the hapless couple went off to carry out their mission according to the plan. Olivia enlisted her father to use his Social Security connections. Jonathan looked for Virginia, who was not easy to find at first, because she had not bought a ticket at the ticket office, and it was difficult to find out where she had gone. When Jonathan came up with the idea of interviewing intercity bus drivers, he found out that just yesterday there had been an accident on one of the buses. According to the driver, a woman with a child had saved his colleague, who had suffered a heart attack followed by cardiac arrest. A joyful smile appeared on Jonathan's face. That's definitely my Virginia who distinguished herself. She is a therapist. She knows the indirect cardiac massage and the rest of it, he thought. Meanwhile, settling into Brandon's stable, Leslie was feeling great. He loved spending time around the animals, cleaning, keeping the stable in perfect order. Virginia wasn't idle either. She managed to go to the district center, where she talked to the head of the therapy department. After listening to the guest, the doctor gladly agreed to take an employee with experience. In this case, he was not at all frightened by the fact that Virginia was fired by article. I'll tell you this, Virginia, I'm not afraid of any rumors. I always give the right person a chance. You can see at once you are just such, so work and do not be afraid of anything, said the elderly doctor and shook the new subordinate's hand. The week flew by, during which Leslie and Virginia put the house in order and even divided the duties. It could not be said that they had become friends or felt a mutual sympathy. Rather, it was like a kind of symbiosis, when two organisms coexist next to each other in order to survive and fight off external threats. Unfortunately, trouble, as we know, comes unexpectedly. And it came in the morning, along with social welfare officers, who gave Virginia and Leslie a real interrogation. Tell me, please, and on what grounds are you keeping Alex with you, without any transition? Asked the representative of the guardianship service. Virginia raised an eyebrow in surprise. Why am I keeping Alex? And I'm his mom. In case you didn't know. The guest chuckled. We don't question your motherhood, but that still doesn't give you the right to kidnap a child. We have a report from the father who reported her missing 2 days ago. So don't think you're going to get away with this now. And if it turns out that there was an abduction, you could end up behind bars. Tears glistened in Virginia's eyes. How can you say that? I mean, that's my son Alex. Does he look like he's being held here against his will? The social welfare officer shook her head. Well, my dear, an independent examination and investigation will show all this. In the meantime, I see that you simply took advantage of the situation, stole the child, and ran away to the countryside. I dare say the conditions here aren't exactly designed for comfortable living. Have you seen your house from the outside? It's in a state of disrepair. What if something happens to the child? Who will be responsible for that? I don't want to go to jail, Virginia stood there and couldn't believe her ears. All this resembled some tragic farce, played out by the will of a talentless scriptwriter. Leslie immediately tried to help, but made things worse. As soon as the social worker found out that Leslie had a criminal record, the case took a completely different turn. You'll have to forgive us, Virginia, she said. But we're taking your son Alex with us. Let him live with his father for the time being. Jonathan, there's a committee waiting for you. A court hearing? We're planning on filing for termination of your parental rights." Virginia went pale. Such an insolent lie had stunned her, and had taken away her ability to think straight. At that moment, she was more like an angry cat. And if it were not for Leslie, who deftly picked her up under the arm, she would have clawed at the woman's face. "You don't want to give the baby back nicely?" "Okay, we'll be back with the police," said the social worker. "And I don't advise you to change your place of residence. Otherwise, we'll file a search warrant. And then you will definitely not escape criminal punishment together with your, how can I put it correctly, your estranged roommate." "What are you implying?" Leslie growled. But the social worker only smiled and waved him off, heading toward the bus stop. Leslie's heart was heavy. He'd wanted to do what was best. But how could he have known that he would only hurt the case by saying he was free? Virginia didn't blame him, though. "Come on, don't worry," she said. "Everything will work out. The main thing is that Alex stayed with me, and the fact that they want to go to the police. We'll see who's who." Leslie shrugged embarrassedly. "But my friend told me that I should go to a lawyer, and I didn't want to." "Listen, Leslie, you don't happen to know someone in this field?" Virginia asked me hopefully. "Well, I do not know, good or not, but there is one," readily answered Leslie. "He defended me in court. A good man in general, positive. I was looking at 7 years, but he got me 5. Virginia smiled. "Well, that's fine with us," she said. "We have to win this case. Otherwise, I'll lose my parental rights and never see Alex again. I'll probably see Alex, but only through a window or on designated days." Since Leslie didn't have his own phone yet, he asked Virginia to give him hers to call, then pulled out of his pocket an old notebook that held the numbers of those he had crossed paths with in his past affluent life. Lawyer Gabriel turned out to be an expert in his field, and in particular was well-versed in family issues related to divorce and division of property. After listening to Virginia on the phone, he thought for a moment and then said, "I think you have a pretty good chance, but there's a lot of work to be done first. For starters, tell Alex how he should behave in court so he doesn't get picked up. And keep me in the loop. I'm starting to prepare for trial." "Thank you, Gabriel. You're very kind," said Virginia. Then she looked fondly at Leslie, who now appeared in a different light. He was no longer the janitor of a farmer's stable, but a former businessman with connections, remembered and respected in high society. At the same time, Leslie still caused a strange feeling, why the late agronomist Kevin left him this very estate with the house. After all, he was essentially a stranger to him, or not such a stranger, as it turned out later. The social workers were still afraid to send the case to the police, because they did not want to publicize it, which could lead to a huge scandal and the dismissal of the people involved. But the lawyer Gabriel in a short time did a truly gigantic work, and prepared a good basis for the defense of the rights of Virginia and her son Alex. Of course, Jonathan had no idea what was really going on all this time. He thought his wife was just living in the country and tending to a cow or goats or something. But the real epiphany came later when Gabriel defeated him in court, getting him such alimony that Jonathan was stunned. He still couldn't believe that such a thing was possible in reality. In the businessman's mind, it was more like robbery. "I'll go to the world. What are you doing?" "Do you want to leave your father without a piece of bread?" he said in a loud voice. But under the angry glance of the judge, he stopped short and realized that the sentence could not be appealed. After that, Jonathan had serious business problems. Sometimes it happens in life when a small offense hides something bigger, something that carries a serious threat. Jonathan found himself under investigation for malfeasance and financial fraud. Jonathan had no choice but to hand the firm over to his ex-wife. There was no one else to count on, because as soon as Olivia learned that her failed fiancé was in trouble, she immediately disavowed him and turned her attention to her backup suitor. To Virginia's honor, it should be said that, having taken possession of her husband's firm, she did not start siphoning off money from it, and continued to develop the business with the help of Leslie's advice, who knew business as well as Jonathan. Thus, Jonathan received qualified legal assistance and did not need anything thanks to the greatly increasing income of the firm. Unfortunately, despite all of Virginia's help and good money, Jonathan was not able to avoid criminal punishment, although he was given a relatively short sentence. But the businessman somehow immediately fell in spirit and publicly apologized to Virginia and Alex. However, it looked unpleasant, reminding the unwilling witnesses of the famous expression about crocodile tears. During the time Jonathan's business had been under Virginia and Leslie's management, it had grown several times over. By that time, the couple had already married, although they did it secretly, without attracting attention, to avoid unnecessary problems. But Olivia did not care about that, because her father was caught in some machinations and removed from the post of chief physician. As a result, Olivia returned to the position of an ordinary general practitioner, deprived of the powerful patron in the person of her father. A month after that, some unpleasant news came from the colony. As it turned out later, Jonathan had been killed in an accident while felling wood. It was not a planned assassination attempt. The death of the prisoner was caused by a violation of safety rules. Despite this, Virginia experienced very contradictory feelings, because no matter how it was, she still did not want Jonathan to die. Leslie was sympathetic to the situation and even helped with the funeral arrangements. And how could it be otherwise, if now they shared all their joys and sorrows equally? By this time, Alex already called him Daddy, which gave a lot of pleasure to the man, who for many years dreamed of his own family. But the most unexpected thing happened when Leslie finally learned the secret of Kevin's agronomist, who protected his old house. As Virginia had once suspected, the elderly man turned out to be Leslie's father, who only learned of his son's existence in his declining years. Once upon a time, Kevin was in a relationship with a girl, with whom he later broke up because of the difference in character and views. And all would be nothing, but this girl was pregnant, gave birth to a child, and left him in a baby house. Since there were no funds for its maintenance at that time, perhaps this situation would have remained unresolved, if by pure chance Kevin did not go to the city to check on the cemetery of his late wife. That's when the lonely man met his first love, who, being terminally ill, wanted to pour out his soul at his mother's grave. Whether there were tears or mutual accusations, no one could say for sure. But the fact that it was after this meeting, the elderly agronomist made a will in Leslie's name, spoke volumes. Having learned the secret of his origin, the businessman smiled and mentally thanked his late father for giving him a house, which began his new family life. After all, if Leslie had not entered his father's inheritance, he would never have met Virginia, with whom he was going to live the rest of his life. When the man entered the room, the young nanny of his children bent down to pick up the toys. D4. Usually Mia made decisions quickly. Life just didn't give her any other options. But at the end of spring, she did have to reflect. For most of her life, Mia had worked for the owners. It used to be called a housekeeper. Today it's called a maid. In her long career, though, Mia had grown up to be a housekeeper. And now Mrs. Ann herself had suggested that her only daughter Chloe work for her in the summer, looking after the children. Mia knew if she mentioned it at home, her daughter would jump at the offer. Chloe loved babies, much more than her peers who had siblings. Chloe grew up as an only child. Many times she told her mother that she wished she had a sister. "It's more fun to be sick together, Mummy," she explained when she was little. "You always make me swallow candied honey when I have a cold. It's so sticky and it hurts my throat. And if I had a sister, would we make faces or grimaces when you gave us those nasty yellow lumps? We'd make fun of the faces we made, and we'd breathe on the smoking potatoes together under a blanket. And then we'd eat those potatoes with butter and tell each other scary stories late into the night, lying in bed." Chloe never reproached her mother. She just dreamed aloud how nice it would be if she had a sister. But Mia still felt guilty. She went to work early and came back late, and so tired that she no longer had the energy for a normal evening life like other people. Chloe felt sorry for her mother and learned early to do housework. When she came back from school, she would have been able to run around to her girlfriends instead of homework. But having finished with her lessons, she would take care of the household, prepare dinner for her mother's arrival, start the laundry. Dust didn't linger on the shelves, and it was so pleasant to walk barefoot on clean and damp floors. If there was one thing that made her acquaintances jealous when it came to Mia, it was her daughter. A beautiful girl, she studies well and does everything in the house for the mistress, while her peers paint their nails. Chloe bakes pies, but Mia realized that her daughter's vocation is not a vocation at all, but a conscience. Chloe loves her mother. There's only two of them left in the world. That's why when Chloe wants the same things as other girls, the same nails, the same music in the headphones, the same parties at friends, she remembers that her mother gives her best at work, so at least at home she should be freed from doing things. And Chloe knows how hard every dollar is given to her mother, and she doesn't ask for anything. On the contrary, happy to work if there is an opportunity to bring the family an extra penny. And Mia denies her daughter that income. A sharp knife, because they are only two left in the world and do not want that by 30 years. Chloe faded, so that not to look at the stars and on the toilet bowl, which must be cleaned to a mirror shine. So Mia was thinking about whether to offer her daughter a job for 3 summer months, or to tell Mrs. Ann at once not to count on Chloe. Mia herself once had no choice. She also grew up with her mother in the same wooden house on the outskirts of the city of Los Angeles, not even on the outskirts in the green zone, where at that time there was only a forest, 2 factory prophylactics and a hospital for tuberculosis patients. There the patients were isolated from society and were fed a fermented drink made from cow's milk and poured into bottles exactly like those given to children in milk kitchens. There were also about 15 cottages, more rustic than urban. They were inhabited by those who worked in the prophylactic centers and in the hospital. They had a hard time because all they enjoyed was fresh forest air and work nearby. And they had to get to shops and everything else by bus, which ran once an hour. Less often it was possible, but not more often. But when those times were over, these places became a tidbit for the new rich. Wooden houses were bought up, the forest around them was cut down, and mansions began to grow here, one higher and more beautiful than the other. First her mother, and then Mia herself were offered to buy their house. And the buyers were very different. Some of them persistently persuaded the owners. Others kept such a tone that one had to fear refuse them, and at night your house will set fire to your house. After all, the buyers were not interested in a simple house with 3 windows, but in land, the land of the national park, a plot surrounded by a pine forest, a stone's throw from the river. And then my mother fell ill, got seriously ill, and never got up again. And she said to her daughter, "I want to die in my house down to the last plank, down to the last blade of grass. Men don't have that sentimentality, they only twist their fingers. Come on, Grandma, let's move to a city flat. There's a clinic a stone's throw away and a pharmacy on the ground floor. You've had enough." Mom loved everything here, the wooden porch and the boards. My grandfather built it, that porch. And peonies, daisies, apple trees all grandmother planted, and pink flowers, the names of which nobody knows, generously sprout every spring and stretch upwards. And at the end of July are already above the windowsill, and in the window to the sick peeking say, "How are you here?" "I'm like an old tree. I can't be transplanted with roots," my mother said, not getting out of bed. "I want to stay in my room until my last day and leave, looking at my flowers, at that spruce that grew with me, and is now so tall you could make a ship's mast out of it." Mia was finishing school then. What was there to do? I couldn't go away to study. You can't leave Mum alone. And you couldn't live on Mum's pension either. I'll get a job, she thought. And the garden fed its owners. But it wasn't enough for Mum's medicine and everything else. So when another mansion was built near their house, the new owners moved in and advertised that they were looking for a housekeeper. Mia was scared out of her wits and decided to give it a try. It was still a young family, a husband and wife. The wife's name was Mrs. Ann and the husband's name was Michael. Mrs. Ann had her own institute. Yes, her own private institute, which gave a very good education. It was a business given to Ann by her parents. The girl grew up spoiled, shone at school, won all competitions and Olympiads. Then she graduated from an economic university with honors and immediately began her PhD thesis. Rich parents who wanted to see their daughter at the head of the family business realized it is not her. Ann went headlong into science. And now she is the rector of the university in 30 and a little. She has under her command excellent teachers. The building is one of the most beautiful in the city, and to study here are strictly treated. Here students will not be able to work part-time somewhere else and attend lectures at will. From time to time it will not be possible to pass an exam or credit by paying a teacher. Here you study seriously, and all the years spent in the walls of the university. Students see nothing but classrooms, library and atrium, where the institute's festivities take place. But during the years of study you can get a foreign internship. And after graduation, you are already expected to work in a prestigious firm. Employers were queuing up for Mrs. Ann's graduates. Well, the couple were very different. Mrs. Ann was a young woman, dressed austere, her age was uncertain. Her short hair had begun to gray early. She wore thick black-rimmed glasses rather than lenses when she had vision problems. She bought expensive but austere clothes without any hint of femininity. Jackets, trousers, blouses in the style of men's shirts. It seemed all the more surprising that Mrs. Ann had chosen such a husband. Michael, though the same age as her, was of a different mold. Very good-looking, like some kind of artiste, but a chatterbox. A chatterbox. When Mia came to the interview, their first meeting with the landlady was called an interview. The girl didn't realize that the handsome man who hung around the house, not knowing what to do with himself, was the landlady's husband. Mrs. Ann was perhaps even more scrupulous about keeping house than she was about her students. Mia knew only that her mistress had been used to servants since childhood, but it was difficult to find a common language with them. Later, Mia learned that she had become the 10th in the last year. Of those who had picked up a Hoover in this house, no one before her had ever stayed here for long. The house was a large, two-story building that could fit a village cultural center. But of the few staff, only a housekeeper and a gardener were hired. The interview was paid for. It meant that any girl would spend at least half a day traveling to the countryside. Mia's eyes widened in surprise when she was told about the money. Pay me for what? It's not like I did anything. She was different from the ones the agency sent at all. There were modern girls, and Mrs. Ann was a little tormented. She'd become quite a good physiognomist by talking to the students. Mrs. Ann had no doubt that the next applicant, who first of all asks about salary, schedule, and weekends, will not remember all her requirements, which meant they would soon have to part ways. So what's next? One has to spend time selecting another housekeeper. Mia had the looks of an 18-year-old girl and the eyes of a grown-up, tired woman. Try to maintain a carefree look when your mother is hopelessly ill, and all the cares of the family have fallen on your shoulders. Besides, not even hoping to be taken in, Mia still sat in front of the potential mistress with a notepad and wrote down wishes. The holy place was Mrs. Ann's office. God forbid she should be careless with office equipment cords, dust off her laptop with a common rag, or move papers so that the landlady couldn't find them right away. No using the host's belongings under any guise. No apologies, I'm sorry, I accidentally put on your slippers or wiped myself with your towel. Her work will be from 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon, and during this time you need to have time to do all the household chores, and iron the laundry, and prepare lunch, so that when the mistress returns, everything will be in order. Do you understand? Mrs. Ann asked, looking at Mia over her glasses. No one had ever called the girl you before. She was embarrassed, blushed, and said she would try harder. Mia decided that she would do her best to keep this place because it was her salvation. The mansion is right next to her house, always able to run to her mum if there was an emergency. At 3 o'clock, she, Mia, would be free by now and would rush to feed her mum lunch. And the salary, if the landlady's not lying, will allow her and her mum to forget about the lack of money. Are you all right with that? Of course. Well, come with me then. I'll tell you more about your duties. And Mrs. Ann walked briskly through the house, Mia following her with the same notebook in her hand. Mia knew from the tone of her voice that she had to remember everything the first time, that no one would repeat it, and that it was better not to make mistakes later. Mrs. Ann was conservative. She was used to a certain kind of soap and toothpaste, to the smell of expensive washing powder, to soft peach towels. How to make the bed, in what order to arrange boxes, jars, and vases in the kitchen cupboard so that everything could be found with closed eyes. Yes, there was a lot to memorize, but Mia was so attentive to every word of her mistress that she was practically never wrong from the first days of work. And just as importantly, she knew her place. They say there was one girl among the maids who was so shallow that she dared to address the mistress as you. And it was certainly her last day in this house. Mia not only did not allow herself to be pandered to, she did not dare to speak too much, only asking questions if there was sometimes a question about cleaning or if she did not know where to put something or what to cook. The rest of the time Mia labored around the house like a bee, dusting everywhere. Until she got used to it, it wasn't easy for her. But it was Michael, the landlady's husband, who made life difficult for her. No, not even the semblance of an affair between them. For Mia, it was taboo. She knew her place. Michael also did not notice the girl too gray and unremarkable she was in his view. Why would he need such a girl when his wife has a lot of beauties in the institute? But soon Mia was calling Michael nothing but a pig. Mrs. Ann had been at work for a long time when Michael first got up, had a leisurely and tasteful breakfast, walked around the house in his dressing gown, and eventually left too. He was listed with Mrs. Ann as someone at the institute, leaving behind a room that needed a daily general cleaning. Unlike the neat and punctual Mrs. Ann, Michael would not bend down to pick up a fallen item. It wouldn't occur to him to make his bed. But most of all, Mia was worried about her host's expensive laptop. Michael could easily pour coffee over it and fill it with crumbs. And if after that expensive equipment stopped working suddenly, Mia would be blamed. Every day she waited with bated breath for the landlady to say that she had done something wrong and she would be sacked. Mrs. Ann kept a close eye on the girl, reprimanding her sparingly. And by New Year's Eve, she gave Mia not only her salary but also a bonus in an envelope. The girl did not have time to buy herself a warm down jacket and boots, which she dreamed of and needed so much. Suddenly her mother passed away. Grief, like a bottomless well. The loan for the funeral, the need to pay it off, and the desire to leave after her mother, all this surrounded Mia with a black blizzard. Maybe because after so many years of living together with her mother, for the first time she was alone and felt fiercely lonely. This hasty marriage happened. Her future husband was a neighbor. Or rather, there was a family of neighbors, elderly spouses, formerly belonging to the middle class. After retirement, they had bought a cottage in the Green Belt, and they had an only son, Ben, who was much older than Mia. Ben had long ago left for another city, a regional center, and was building a personal life there. And then suddenly his parents started looking for a bride. Mrs. Caroline had talked to Mia in the shop, walked her home, and asked her to visit. She looked round, asked for tea, and spoke slowly and thoroughly about her son. With his first wife, he was unlucky. She was a mercantile woman. So Ben recently divorced, and the ex-wife took everything from him. The worst part was the flat. Mrs. Caroline's voice had changed to one of hatred. We helped to buy the place. Ben did a beautiful renovation. He took a year's leave from the institute and spent a whole year fixing up the house. Can you believe it? He did everything with his own hands. Wardrobes, shelves, hangers. And that wretch Emma. She thought she'd paid me off, said Mrs. Caroline. She borrowed money from someone, called Ben back, paid him back. Tears. You can't buy anything decent with that money. And Emma said they were even, the way she'd packed. You wouldn't believe the bags she stuffed with cheap stuff. You know, the kind they sell in grocery shops, paper ones, full of stuff. I stuffed everything in there, and unwashed pans with grease dripping from them, and my downy shawl that I'd forgotten, stuffed the bags, put them in the hallway. Go away, Basya, and give me the keys. And this fool started playing the noble game. My father and I persuaded Ben you should have sued your Emma, and for every rag, because there are no children in common. Why feel sorry for such a cheat, but no, he just walked away. When he showed me how much money Emma had given him, my father and I gasped, just enough for a room in an old foundation. You know, the ones that are going to be demolished. They say there's a whole city resettlement program coming up. They'll move out the communal rooms and give him a one-bedroom. But in the meantime, as soon as he has a free moment, he comes to us, such a golden boy, and he's so unlucky. We'd find a girl, even if she was poor, but decent. And we'd live happily ever after, like me and my father. Mrs. Caroline was no longer acting as a matchmaker, but as the owner of a purse that needed to find a suitable mate and procreate. How can Jack and I be without grandchildren in our old age? How old are you? 19. It's about time you had a baby. It's about time, girl. Mia, who'd been trying not to contradict her elders since she'd started working as a maid, had lost her right to speak and listened. Mrs. Caroline drew her conclusions and brought her son to meet her the next weekend, as soon as he arrived. Ben was a short man of 34 with a disproportionately large head and sparse, downy hair. He was beginning to show a bald spot. He was dressed differently from his peers. Mia couldn't help thinking that his mom had probably picked out his clothes for him and carefully stored them away year after year. You don't see those blue and white flowered shirts with small white letters in any shop anymore. Maybe they used to sell them. Ben immediately looked at Mia with admiration, not knowing her at all. Just by looking at her, he already seemed to be in love. His eyes were blue and his gaze as simple-minded as a child's. And immediately, after that first meeting, Ben began to court the girl. He came every weekend, and during the week he called and talked to Mia. He brought her some trinkets, perfume, and a black velvet bag, a beautiful cup and saucer. Perhaps Mia had never been able to buy anything like that for herself. They lived on a pittance, and Ben proposed marriage very quickly a month after they met. By then he'd already fixed Mia's porch and was digging beds. And Mrs. Caroline was constantly giving the girl home-cooked food or something sweet for tea. It created the illusion of a family for Mia. It seemed that she was gradually being incorporated into it, like a jigsaw puzzle, taking her place in the overall picture. Of course, Mrs. Caroline won't replace Mum. They can't even be next to each other, Mia thought. But I'll have a husband to take care of me, and my mother-in-law will be my soulmate. The loneliness would end. And Mia said yes. A month later, they were married. And a year began for Mia, which she later recalled as something strange and unreal. Ben willingly left his communal flat and moved in with her. It took Mia, inexperienced in these matters, 3 weeks to realize that Ben was an inveterate alcoholic. Before, his parents had poured him a glass of cold water when they sent him to visit a girl. And during his brief, no longer bachelor period, Ben kept to himself, didn't drink. But when he felt himself an independent head of the family, he went into all sorts of trouble. If he and his young wife were out for a walk, Ben would go to the shop for a minute and then go on with a bottle. In the evenings, he would take a bottle and ask to go somewhere under the plausible pretext, I have to help a friend, or I've been called to work. In reality, Ben would go to a nearby bar and stay there for hours before coming home drunk. Mia cried and demanded a promise from her husband that it was the last time, that it was the very, very last drink. And Mrs. Caroline had a heart-to-heart talk. Nothing worked. Under the threat of divorce, Ben went to a desperate step for himself, found somewhere in the private sector, a hypnotist grandmother who encodes to classical music with a guarantee, as he told himself. In fact, Ben may have been to the woman, but he would go straight from her to the shop. He would have a drink on the way and return home, swaying, with a branded dark bag and with his naive blue eyes showing that the bag was empty and therefore there was nothing to scold him for. Mia's character had changed so much over the year that, having been quiet before, in November she smashed a bottle of vodka against the kitchen sink and, holding the shards in her hands, demanded that Ben leave immediately, along with his belongings. And in December, Mia gave birth to a daughter and named her Chloe. The parents stood up for their son. They sold their house and flat and bought a new flat in the regional center, where they settled together. The father, thanks to his connections, got certificates about Ben's low income in the new place. It's nothing, which means the child support will be symbolic. You feel sorry for your child and we feel sorry for ours, Mrs. Caroline told Mia over the phone in an icy voice. All friendship with her mother-in-law ended instantly. There was no mention of gifts for her granddaughter, and Mia had only one hope left for Mrs. Ann, who, against all odds, had saved a place for her while the young woman was unable to go to work after giving birth. Chloe was 3 months old when Mia entrusted her to a neighbor and went to work. Even a still young, full-figured woman managing such a large house would be hard, especially when you consider the demands Mrs. Ann had made on the household. Sometimes, if Mia had the energy to read a book or watch a film in the evenings, she drew parallels. So, watching the film in bed with the enemy, the main villain demanded of his wife that the towels in the bathroom should be mixed to the same length, 3 pieces hanging evenly, edge to edge. Mia thought that Mrs. Ann had not yet reached such a point, but probably will soon. And later, while reading the novel The Defeated, Mia burst into flames and said to her daughter, who was then about 8 years old, "Look, Chloe, how well written. I've never seen such an insufferable old woman before. She's a neat little bore. She's only uses 8 towels, and they're all hung on nails. God forbid they get mixed up. She squeaks, and she's got eyes like a lynx. They'll spot her. You can't just wipe the table, but first with rag number 1, and then with rag number 2. And there are 8 rags, too." "Is your landlady as mean as that?" Chloe asked. "No, but Mrs. Ann has 1,000 rules she can't break. If I'd forgotten or messed up a few times, I'd have been kicked out the door, too." What helped Mia was that she was responsible, conscientious, and at first she was so afraid of losing her place that there was nothing more important to her in life than doing things the way Mrs. Ann used to. But afterwards it became a habit for Mia herself, and she began to fulfill her household rules on automatic. Sometimes when Mia returned from work, too broken, too exhausted, she would sneak pain pills. Chloe would ask her, "Get away from your Baba Yaga." But once Mia caught her breath, she asked, "Where would I go? I'm close to the house and I can come running any minute if you need me." and Mrs. Ann's pay is good and reliable. She's like a Swiss bank, even if she's demanding, even if she's not sentimental, but she pays fairly. And looking for another job, what am I going to find now? I've never learned anything in my life. All I know is how to do housework. At her landlady's house, Mia remained as silent as ever, never opening her mouth. But when Mrs. Ann decided to have children in her old age, the housekeeper sighed and said in a low voice, "It's going to be hard on you. You're judging yourself, aren't you?" Mrs. Ann might not have meant to be a bit of a sarcasm, it just came out of the blue. "No," said Mia, using a special brush to brush the dust off some super valuable Danish porcelain. "I understand the difference. Who was I when I gave birth to Chloe? Penniless, divorced. In my maternity ward, they wouldn't let loved ones into the room. They'd stand outside the windows. The girls called me at first, saying, 'Look, there he is, waving balloons, if it's yours.' I had to say that there was no one to visit me, even though I was married at that time, according to my passport. Then, a couple of months later, we got an official divorce. And for all these years, neither Ben, nor father-in-law, nor mother-in-law, who seemed to dream of a granddaughter and asked me to give birth. No one has never once asked about Chloe and did not come to visit, and gifts for the girl's birthday did not pass only a receipt for alimony. Once a month, the postman threw in the box generously alimony as much as 2,000, so that the daughter, as they say, do not deny themselves anything. I know, Mrs. Ann, that you wouldn't dream of living like this. May your little ones do well, but not like mine. I was always afraid I'd never get Chloe back on her feet. I wouldn't have the time. Something would happen to me and she'd be without her mom, and I wouldn't get to watch her grow up. I won't stand up for her if someone hurts her. I won't wipe away her tears if she cries." Mia was embarrassed and didn't continue. But she couldn't say that Mrs. Ann, for all her wealth, was not immune to disease or the accidents of fate. Medicine allowed her to give birth to twins at that age, and if everything was done artificially, twins are not uncommon. And then it was just a matter of asking God to let her raise her sons and enjoy them. And Mrs. Ann, though she was usually quick to use harsh, barbed words, this time she remained silent in thought. At that time, the nannies in the house were changing at the speed of light. Mrs. Ann would not have cared for Sam and Ben herself, not even in her mind. She wasn't going to leave school. As soon as the mistress got stronger after childbirth, no more dizziness and weakness in her legs, she hurried to her favorite university, to her office. Reading lectures and signing papers is much easier than babysitting twins, Mia thought. Mrs. Ann was incapable of such self-denial as enduring sleepless nights and putting up with the children's whims. Perhaps her mistress was afraid that she was missing time that she could never get back and would be alone in her old age. Because her useless husband Michael was no better than loneliness. That's why Mrs. Ann decided to have children, but she was not able to sacrifice her time and comfort for them. Nannies started coming to the house. She remembered the dog waltz with its simple rhythm. Everything was played out like a sheet music. Another applicant at the interview, the girl was delighted with the salary and conditions, and 2 or 3 days of work and a kick under the heel point, because none of them could not please. Mia had her own relationship with the nannies, whom her landlady Mrs. Ann changed like gloves. Some the housekeeper supported, though there wasn't much she could do. Mia would take another sack nanny into the kitchen and give her tea. "Don't cry," she'd say. "I can tell you one thing for sure, Mrs. Ann won't write you a bad reference. She just won't take the trouble. She'll forget you exist tomorrow. So you'll be fine. You'll get a new job, you'll make money." She talked to me like that. The resentment and bitterness of exile choked her. Now, I have the feeling that there is no one worse than me in the world, that I am the laziest and most promiscuous. But to put it all out of my head, it seems to me that the mistress has such a character that she herself is not always happy about it. It's the same with children. You know what they say about kids he sat on gray? This is when a child realizes that he is behaving badly, that he is just being cranky for nothing. Then he's disgusted with himself, but he can't help it. That's how it is with Mrs. Ann. She has no one left in her life except her husband. Her parents are already dead, her children are still small, and all the energy she has after work, after the institute, all her thoughts she stuffs with such nonsense that the vases on her shelf should stand in a certain order, and the servants should walk in one half, and so on. Wave your hand and get out of here. You're about to have a new life. When the girl's grief had subsided a little, she found the ability to think about someone other than herself. "How have you survived so many years here?" The former nanny clapped her wet eyelashes, but Mia wasn't being sincere. "Well, someone has to keep an eye on this house," she said. "And you go home now and forget about what happened." But not every fired employee deserves sympathy. Mia knew there were those who hoped to sneakily ignore the housekeeper's rule. It's a case of just in case. The housekeeper was not going to comfort anyone, but only thought that she would have a hard time in the near future. While the mistress was looking for a new nanny, Mia had to take care of the babies. Michael was not only not a good father, but no father at all. He let the children do anything, as long as they did not cry or bother him, did not interfere with his life. Mrs. Ann nearly fainted once. She came home and saw Sam and Peter running across the open piano with bare feet right on the keys. And the piano, by the way, is a 19th century piano from a famous German company. The children were left to Michael, and he quietly settled in a soft armchair with headphones on, watched some action film. From that very day, the father's role in the family became purely decorative. Mrs. Ann no longer assigned him to look after the children. On the contrary, the newly hired nanny was told to see that the twins did not sneak into their father's room and do something with his connivance. As a result, the father could say hello to his sons, meeting them by chance in the big house, stroke the boys on the head, ask how they were doing, but no more. This situation suited both parties, children and adults alike. In the period of supervision, Mia watched over the boys and fed and entertained them without fail. Sometimes Chloe also came to help. The twins adored her. They perceived the girl as an older sister. No one could think of such exciting games. And at the same time, Chloe watched closely to ensure that the kids did not make trouble, do not go wild in the house, and nothing happened to them. Once Mrs. Ann returned unexpectedly from a business trip. Chloe was playing with the children in the garden. The three of them spread a blanket on the grass and competed to see who could come up with the scariest story. No one heard the wicket door open. Mrs. Ann stood looking at the friendly group and said to Mia, "I wouldn't mind if your daughter became a childminder during the summer holidays." This was a complete surprise to Mia. So the landlady was willing to pay her daughter's salary. But the housekeeper didn't even nod. Listened to the offer nonchalantly. She was going to give it to her daughter and let her decide for herself. Chloe saw herself, and from the stories of her mother knew that the work in this house is not sugar. So it was up to her to agree or not. "Oh, let's give it a try," Chloe lit up. "I was looking for something while I was free from school anyway. Do you think it would be easier for me to waitress in a cafe or dishwasher or camp counselor? Let's at least spend the summer together. I don't see you with your job." Well, look what happened to the next babysitter. Until now, Chloe was amused to hear stories about the hapless maid. Mia just shrugged her shoulders. It's easy to guess they fired her again. Why? This time she deserved it. Mia said it in her heart. An old woman came in and needed the money so badly she made the big mistake of pleasing the kids. You know how that turned out? The boys ended up smashing an antique statue that Mrs. Ann had brought back from somewhere in Europe. But most importantly, they sneaked into the landlady's study, got into a fight, and knocked coffee over her laptop. It's an oil painting, isn't it? I don't need to explain to you what happened next. Chloe sighed. I can imagine. So you're going to have to, if you take it on. And until the new nanny comes in, haul all that load from morning till night. Wake the boys up, dress them, feed them, and work on them till bedtime. Mrs. Ann's going to Chicago for a week. But you know how she is. Everything in the house must go on without her. No indulgences. Chloe didn't think long. Tell her tomorrow morning that I agree. And she did not say how much she would pay me. For the first time after Chloe took up her duties, everything went quietly. Mrs. Ann didn't seem to look at the girl much, but both Nanny and her mother knew that she didn't. The mistress notices everything. And if Chloe gets offense, she'll be refused a place. And yet the girl was a little easier than other nannies. Firstly, she sincerely attached to the children, and the feeling was mutual. Secondly, on every question, Chloe could turn to her mother for advice. Soon Mrs. Ann did leave as she had intended. It was then that everything began. Michael, in the eyes of Mia, called Mia by patronymic, but in the eyes of the patronymic he did not deserve. So Michael usually, when his wife was not at home, spent his time quite pleasantly. He either relaxed in the garden, where there were pools, sunbeds to sunbathe, and a gazebo, where it is so nice to sit in the summer with a glass of something cool. If the weather didn't cooperate, they could sit in the living room by the fireplace or in the marital bedroom on the huge Arabian-style bed. Mia thought the bed had been bought for Michael's sake, too. Mrs. Ann had gone along with his craving for luxury. But when Chloe came into the house, Michael changed his habits. Now he sort of remembered that he was a father, and he looked in on the boys more often than ever. And they, unaccustomed to such attention, did not know how to behave. You can't be naughty. Sam and Peter had learnt that. What else could they do with this man smiling at them and asking how they were doing? Who would know him? Mia guessed that Michael had his own plans and tried to stay close to her daughter. That afternoon it started to rain lightly. Chloe and the twins were in the nursery. Mia was putting away things hidden from prying eyes by the open wardrobe doors she did not see, but felt that there was someone else in the room. And then through the cracks she saw someone she couldn't even think of as the owner. "Isn't it time for them to go to bed?" Michael asked. His voice sounded a little hoarse to Mia. "We're past our bedtime," Chloe said, taking a box of knots off the shelf. "We sleep until 4. "It's a pity." "Well, what then, girl?" "Now we have a scheduled walk, but you see what's outside the window." The girl bent down to pick up the fallen toys. Mia didn't immediately realize what had happened. Chloe was in denim shorts. From the sudden movement, the edges of her panties showed from under them. A strange sound came from where the door was. Michael choked. He literally choked on his saliva, drooling what an accurate thing someone had once said. Mia folded the sheet in 4 and came out of the wardrobe. Now the owner had to pick his jaw up off the floor instead of drooling. "Are you home too?" was all he could find to say. "I'm always home." Mia's voice was impassive, though her insides were raging. "Michael, did you want to play with the kids?" "Me? No, please don't mind, I won't bother you." As soon as the man left, Mia slammed the door behind him. "Did you see that?" she asked. She thought Chloe should have realized it. Her daughter surprised her by raising her eyebrows in bewilderment. "What was I supposed to see? How he looked at you. But so were you." "I bet he did, wearing a thong to work." That old bastard. Mia never swore in front of her daughter. But today she didn't hold back, with all the profanity of a sailor. "He's not old at all." Chloe sat down on the carpet, opening a box with knots, and the twins immediately surrounded her. Mia was silent, and then came and stood so that her daughter looked at her willy-nilly. Chloe lowered her eyes. "You know that you and I are alone in the house now," Mia said. "The servants," Chloe said, emphasizing her mother's position. "The servants," Mia continued stiffly. "And so I'll tell you, I've never wondered how two people as different as Mrs. Ann and her husband came to be together. In my opinion, he's not a good match for her." "Well, that's as simple as it gets. She bought it. What's there to guess at? He's 10 times her age and probably suits her in every way. He's doing just fine living here on his own." Chloe, maybe, was waiting for her mother to object. But Mia continued in the same tone. Her daughter hadn't heard her say that before. "Anyway, it's their life. And you and I have been given the trust of letting us into this house that has opened up before us. And it has never, ever occurred to me to take anything here, not a biscuit in the kitchen, let alone another man's husband." "I see," said Chloe. "What do you understand?" "I see now why Mrs. Ann loves you so much. She needn't get a dog with you. And what? A golden woman serves. She keeps quiet, barks at strangers, protects her master's goods." Chloe suddenly changed. Mia asked almost pitifully. "It is you, so Ben once could say so, but from you." Chloe was silent, then said, "Machine folding puzzles, well, what now to regret? All the time should have chosen a father of pure, noble blood." Mia felt infinitely tired. "Well, the only thing I'll ask of you is that I'll think of a reason why you can't work here anymore. Today you have already worked as much time as you should, and tomorrow." Chloe was silent. She was making a beautiful tower out of cardboard squares, and her fingers trembled slightly. "All right," she said at last. "And I also thought you were right. Remember when you said you wanted to go to New York or Los Angeles? And now I can see for myself that you shouldn't stay here after high school. The further you go, the more you change, the more you become a new bird. You used to be different, and now you're going to look at me funny. I'll still be a maid. Our house will remain old and dilapidated. In short, whatever I can put away until you pass your exams. I'll give you all this money, and God be with you. You know how to do everything, you've learned everything, and I think you'll do well. But we can talk until then." Chloe looked into her mother's eyes for the first time, and something in the girl's gaze flashed so childish, former. And both mother and daughter laughed embarrassed. The storm had passed. The last school year passed quietly for Chloe. She never found out what Mia said to her mistress. But the girl was no longer invited to work as a nanny. "You better try harder at school," said her mother. "Do you still have to go to university?" Mia thought that Mrs. Ann, if she was so good to Chloe, might offer her a place at her university. But the thought flashed and quickly disappeared. Mia knew how much it cost to study at a private institute. And Mrs. Ann was very good with money. She had no reason to give her housekeeper's daughter such a luxurious gift. Nothing much seemed to have changed in the life of the little family. As before, the tired mother returned in the evenings from work, and Chloe had time to study for honors and run the household. Enough with Mia, God. And yet for the first time between mother and daughter there was some reticence. Chloe passed her final exams with high marks. Helped the girl also that she was not nervous. God knows why. When they were taken to another school to pass literature, Chloe's friend became ill. Worries, stress. The teacher, who came with the guys, did not allow to approach Inna. The organizers themselves called an ambulance to the girl. When the medics left, Chloe sat looking at the pale faces of the graduates, gnawed the cap of a cheap plastic pen, and wondered why she herself did not tremble inside. Probably because Chloe realized that no matter how she passed her exams, the life she had set for herself would not leave her. So what was there to worry about? Chloe received high scores. If she stayed in her city, the choice of educational institutions for her would be small. But her mother looked as if in water in her thoughts the girl swung to the capital universities. Mia saved money as well as a handsome young man. But she still gave her daughter a decent sum to Chloe to buy a dress not worse than other girls. In her daughter's classmates it was a real quest, which they passed with burning eyes. To order in the atelier or to buy. And if to buy, where to buy? Short or ball gown style. Or maybe a chic evening dress, sparkling with rhinestones. Mia paid not only for the dress but also for everything she was supposed to: photos, videotaping, a restaurant. Certificates to the best graduates were handed out in the town square. The guys who received medals stood on an improvised stage, and a golden rain of confetti fell on their heads. Glitter was left to shine in the girls' ceremonial hairstyles. And Mia cried for the first time in years. Maybe for the first time since her mother's death. The main stage of her dream, getting her daughter back on her feet, was behind her. Yes, there was still university ahead, a diploma. But still, if something happened to her, Chloe would not be lost. Somewhere, but will enter. And the main thing, she will not be given to an orphanage. Thoughts of orphanage often came to Mia, because she knew her daughter has no one but her. In all these years, Ben had never appeared on the horizon. Never once brought his daughter a birthday present, never asked if Chloe needed anything. Immediately after the divorce was formalized, Ben's parents hustled and found him a new wife, older, and with a teenage son. The wife was patient and obediently endured her husband's drunkenness. For this, her father-in-law and mother-in-law constantly gave her gifts and promised her a flat after his death. Mia knew if she left before the deadline on the other world, and Chloe in the family of his father will not be taken, and surrendered to the state. Now the daughter is an adult. Mia wiped the tears running down her cheeks, and Chloe seemed to her more beautiful than Botticelli's Venus. That evening at the restaurant, Mia sat in the corner of a long table, in the farthest and darkest corner, not mingling with the other parents, and drank too much. She hadn't had a more worthy occasion in years past to relax, to take a short break from the harness she was pulling. When Chloe, in her silk dress, approached her mother, Mia looked at her daughter with an unseeing and slightly hazy look and could say nothing. I see. The phone was in the girl's hand. Having just taken selfies, she started dialing a number. I'll send you home in a taxi now, Chloe said. Mia tried to object that it was expensive, that other parents would give her a lift, since the buses were no longer running. But Chloe wouldn't listen. Once home, Mia was going to wait for her daughter to make sure she had met the dawn and arrived safely. But instead, as she was in her best dress suit, she fell asleep on the bed. And in the morning, having made sure that Chloe was in her room, Mia went to work as usual and dusted with a special brush, and scolded herself for the fact that after yesterday's shaking hands. Chloe passed the competition in the institute she chose and went to Los Angeles. Mia was anxious to go with her. She would take her daughter to a strange and unfamiliar city, help Chloe to settle in the hostel, and look at the famous city, which she had never seen before. It would have been the biggest trip of Mia's life. But Chloe wouldn't take her. I'll do it myself, she said. You'll be tired going back and forth, the road and all that. I'm a pretty independent person. Have you forgotten? Mia knew one thing: her daughter had grown more and more confident over the years. Now her tone was such that it was not Chloe to her mother, but her mother to her. Chloe left. Mia was left alone. She still worked for Mrs. Ann, and she was so used to her housekeeper that she never took on any other servants but her. If there was a general cleaning of the house, the housekeeper invited the women from the cleaning company. Mrs. Ann was a rather demanding mistress, and even just listening to her was enough to make Mia whisper in her ear. Have you been working for her so long? My God, how have you stayed here so long? Mia just shrugged her shoulders. She didn't understand why she lived in this place, and never tried to change it. And now she wanted to take on a heavier job so that she wouldn't think about anything, so that she'd be tired to death. And not to disturb her memory, not to make her soul whimper. Idleness was her enemy even now. She saw her late mother, and then she realized that Chloe would never return to her hometown. And Mia could not drive away from herself the question whether she had not flushed her own life into that waste place, which she had to clean every day. Did she have no choice, or did she? And she'd missed it. When the owners were away in Los Angeles, which was often, when Mrs. Ann had some scientific business there, Mia had the nerve to ask Chloe to bring her some things from home. The hostess pressed her lips together a little, but did not refuse. Of course, she did not take the trouble to visit the girl. She came to the hotel herself. It didn't occur to Mia that it was humiliating for Chloe to appear as an uninvited guest and in an expensive hotel to take those hopeless checkered bags at the reception. That's what the shuttles used to carry. The bags were like a stamp, like a stigma. The front desk girls would hide their grins when she picked them up. And one time Chloe couldn't take it anymore and called home. I got everything, but don't need any more, don't pass it on. I've got everything. Mia realized that her daughter had taken another step sideways, severed another thread linking her to home apple jam and her mother's bound socks. Socks didn't fit into Chloe's new life, and yet the daughter called more or less regularly, did not forget to congratulate her mother on holidays. Happy birthday, Chloe would say. Mia herself would not even remember about it. If Chloe could not get out to visit, it is understandable. She had a session, or practice, or some friends called, and it is impossible to refuse. Mia was not offended, she was quietly sad. Chloe didn't live in the hostel anymore. She worked part-time, rented a flat with a friend for two. Mia thought that her daughter would probably get married soon. Once again, when the owners left for Los Angeles, Mrs. Ann returned early. I'm alone, she said nonchalantly, no matter what happened. But this time Mia sensed trouble, and she wasn't wrong. We need to talk. Let's go into the study, Mrs. Ann said. Mia followed and thought about what she was about to hear. She was being fired. This way everything could be solved on the spot. No need to have a conversation in the office. Mrs. Ann sat down at the antique desk, which she loved very much. Sit down, she said, pointing to the chair opposite. She was silent for a minute or two, then spoke this time. I didn't just go to a scientific conference. I saw a doctor. He confirmed the diagnosis. Mrs. Ann named the disease. Mia gave a startled gasp. She'd heard it was a short-lived disease, a year and a half. only 7% passed the 5-year mark. And only a few people lived long. Mrs. Ann translated the diagnosis into numbers. Are you going to cry? No time. There's a lot to do, a lot to do. She began to list what she'd come up with in the last sleepless nights. Sam and Peter would be going away to an expensive public school. There was no telling how things would turn out. They'd better get used to it right away. There they would be brought up to adulthood. Their eyes met. And they both remembered the conversation they'd had long ago, when Mia had mentioned her main fear, not being able to raise her daughter in time. But Mrs. Ann had other options. Her children would not be lost. I'm going away for treatment. No, not abroad. To the same doctor where I was, the same hospital. But I won't be home for long. You'll see to it that everything goes on as usual. Mrs. Ann paused again and added, and if anything, you'll see to the funeral. With a gesture, she stopped Mia's objection. I'll give all the arrangements to the funeral parlor. Just pay, and they'll do it for you. It'll just take an outside eye to see if everything's going right. As you realize, I can't do it myself. And Michael's always missing the important or the unimportant. And Mrs. Ann did go away for a long time, 6 months. She'd call Mia from time to time, asking about the house, giving her directions. Although Mia had been a housekeeper for so many years that she knew the daily seasonal chores by heart, when to wash the windows, when to do the general cleaning, when to have the carpets cleaned. Mia didn't ask unnecessary questions. She tried to understand how her hostess was doing by her tone. The tone was uneven, lifeless. And then Mrs. Ann rang to say that she and her husband were coming back in 2 days. Welcome back, she said. Mia couldn't believe that she missed her, that she was waiting for her mistress to arrive. With hidden joy and at the same time with fear, what news would she bring? She didn't have to ask. Mia realized everything herself when the mistress, leaning on her husband's arm, walked towards the house. It was not for nothing that Mrs. Ann had told her to prepare a room on the ground floor. Not the marital bedroom, not her favorite study. She couldn't climb the stairs. No hospice, Mrs. Ann said. I don't expect the walls of home to heal, but at least they're comforting. Mia was busy helping the patient to get settled. She hadn't expected Michael to look so upset, partly even confused. Was Mrs. Ann's husband more mentally organized than Mia had thought? She thought nothing could upset him. The housekeeper had become a carer. Mrs. Ann had a rare patience with pain. Mia realized, however, that medication couldn't take it away completely. But when it came to routine matters, the landlady was the same. Here she was at her best. It was as if Mia was back in the days of her youth, when she had been terrified of making a mistake, not making the coffee strong enough or too sweet, not changing the linen in time, not answering a question in the wrong words. It's a good thing Mrs. Ann was farsighted enough, and the twins, Sam and Peter, had gone to a boarding school beforehand. There was no need for the boys to see all this. Mia remembered the last few weeks as a blur. It was unreal. After Mrs. Ann said, I want to tell you about Michael. Mrs. Ann was lying on her back. Mia made her comfortable on 2 soft pillows. It seemed to make the pain feel less. Or maybe it just seemed that way, and the metal in her mistress's voice was almost entirely gone. She could only speak quietly now, and quietly what metal? I never thought I would draw a parallel with you. My fate and yours, Mrs. Ann said with a quiet, slightly perceptible chuckle. But wait you. I was the only daughter in my family too. My parents were high-flying birds. Business owners of factories, newspapers, steamships. We're almost the same generation. You must remember this poem. They could have bought me anything. If the moon in the sky was for sale and I wanted it, they'd buy it, but they had a strict idea of who I could and couldn't be friends with. It was best not to be friends with anyone at all. My parents were used to not trusting anyone. Big business is a cruel business. Someone you thought of as a friend will become a competitor tomorrow. Well, I was a good girl. I stayed at home and read books. Fortunately, I always liked to read and always wanted to learn more. I was driven to and from school, and Michael was in the same class as me. Mia wanted to say, oh, she could barely contain herself. Mrs. Ann's husband looked at least 10 or 15 years younger than her. And now that Mrs. Ann was coping with her illness, Michael seemed like her son. He was the handsomest, brightest boy around me, Mrs. Ann continued. And I was very ordinary in appearance, a very ordinary girl. and I had no friends, but I had a lot of complexes because of book characters. It's like that they think their peers speak a different language. I couldn't fit in with any of my peers. I wasn't bullied, I was shunned. You know how a river goes round a rock on both sides and runs away? I didn't even try to get Michael to like me, because everyone would say I bought his attention. Even now, before, when people looked at us, they would say in hushed tones that I had bought myself a husband. You've probably heard those words more than once. Mia wouldn't admit to hearing them from her own daughter, Chloe. So I didn't fill my head with dreams and love, but tried to study, as one comrade used to say. And then came graduation night. Mrs. Ann stopped talking, taking a breath. I had a gold medal, like your Chloe. Well, the tradition of graduation is a timeless one. We sat in the restaurant, and then the whole group went out to see the sunrise. It took a long walk along a path through the woods to get to the riverbank. We wanted to wait until morning to watch the sun come up. For me, it was almost the first time I was allowed to go out with my class without guards or chaperones. Maybe I deserved it with my medal, and I was allowed such a holiday, allowed to go with the guys. After all, we were parting forever. We'll never see each other again. But for me, that trip almost ended in tragedy. Mrs. Ann closed her eyes and put her hand on Mia's arm, squeezing her cold fingers lightly. Imagine a large reservoir just above the dam. They're not called seas for nothing. These reservoirs, they're endless. When the hydroelectric power station was built, the river overflowed. Everyone knew that there were villages, old houses, even a church at the bottom. And the new banks turned out to be so steep, like precipices, sandy precipices. I don't remember why I got separated from the guys. Maybe I was distracted by something, but I was a few meters below the almost steep edge of the bank, and I couldn't grab onto anything. The slope was sandy, the sand was crumbling from under my fingers, and there was water and deep water below. I had read that near the hydroelectric power station the depth was 50 meters, but even here it was pretty deep, and I couldn't swim. No matter how many times my parents took me to seas and resorts, I never learned to swim. Don't shout, no one will hear you. Even if someone comes to help, they can't get me out. I could drown dozens of times. But I didn't even have time to call for help. I was just trying to stay where I was on the slope and not go into the water. And then I saw Michael. He'd fallen behind the others too. He knew right away that I was in trouble. He said, "Hold on. Don't move." I thought he was going to call the boys or our class teacher, Mrs. Olivia, who was coming with us. But instead, Michael ran into the woods and fetched a thick stick, lowered it to me, and told me to grab onto it as hard as I could. God, how ashamed I was. Mrs. Ann recalled, I've always been overweight, and he was carrying me. I could see how hard it was for him, but I couldn't let go either. I'd have died, you know. He pulled me out in the end. I was in tears and snot from fear. My hair was all messed up. Remember what we used to say when we were kids, hairdo? I fell down, I almost crushed myself. My dress is dirty. I told Michael I was done with the sunrise meeting. So I went home. He ran round to ours, said sorry, we're leaving, and walked me all the way home. Nobody ever found out about that story. I've only just told you now, Mrs. Ann said to Mia. You might think that's when we started having an affair, don't you? Wait, Michael was just helping me out then without a second thought. And we went our separate ways. I went to college, he joined the army, then got married unsuccessfully. Anyway, we crossed paths by chance years later, and not even at a reunion, but just in the city, and we recognized each other immediately. I was always like that, short haircut, black-rimmed glasses. I would have recognized him, whatever he was. Maybe another girl would have forgotten about it long ago. But I remembered, and I'd never forget. I remembered that he saved my life. All the years I'd had since that cliff, all my luck, all my joy, the fact that I could breathe, feel, look at the sky, all of it was thanks to him. He gave it to me. Now, Mia, he was in trouble when we met. Mrs. Ann's cold fingers squeezed Mia's hand again. He's divorced now, and no one can know that. Never to anyone, ever. He was on drugs, a good one. And that's when I took it upon myself to save him. My dad was gone by then. Dad would never have let me get involved with a man like that in the first place. And Mom? I was already living on my own and I could keep it from my mom for a long time. Michael didn't even have a place to live at the time, just a room. The neighbors wanted to evict him because he had friends coming round. The door wouldn't close, and those friends would stay overnight, because in that state, when they'd already taken a dose, where would they go? I took Michael away, paid for his treatment in a very good clinic. He was treated abroad, lived there for a few months, came back and stayed with me. When he proposed to me, he probably didn't even think I would accept. The guys who knew me from childhood always felt the difference between me and them. And I said yes. As they say nowadays, I said yes gladly. I convinced myself I was married because he saved my life. I didn't admit to myself that I'd been in love with him since high school, and when Michael was out of my life, I felt very unhappy. That's not a very clear comparison, is it? Well, like a person who has nothing at all, because all I wanted was him. Him alone and no one else. You're about to tell me how everyone around you said Michael was just getting comfortable. He had money now. I got him a job at my institute. He was living comfortably from now on. But, I didn't care about that. It was worse than that. I always realized very well that he didn't love me. It's like a match, isn't it? It's like a match. It either flares up or it doesn't. Well, he never lit even a little flame of love for me. The kind of love that I would have lit in him. And my passion got kind of angry. I started demanding that other people do things my way. Because I couldn't do that with Michael. Long pause. Why am I telling you all this? Mrs. Ann continued. I thought Michael couldn't love anyone at all, only a life of luxury. Turns out he doesn't. He does. He loved your Chloe. Mia stopped breathing. And Mrs. Ann grinned. I knew it right away when I was in the hospital, when it was already known for sure that I would not recover. They met, and I didn't interfere. I even thought afterwards that maybe it would be better for him not to be alone. But in the end, your daughter rejected him. She just said she had another boyfriend, almost her age. She told him to go away and look after me, or he'd look like a real scoundrel in her eyes. His wife's dying, and he's lying there. Chloe had never let that stop her before. I'm gone. His mates left him. He's got nothing ahead of him. You know what Michael did? He did what all weak people do. He got back on drugs. That's why I'm telling you this old story, Mia. Not so you can fight with your daughter about me. But you had an alcoholic husband yourself. You know what fixes the hump, so I want you to keep an eye on him. By the time Mrs. Ann was finished, she had a persistent, painful dry cough, and no special syrup or water helped. Nothing worked. Finally, she was able to continue. He's in good health for now. I don't want him to end up like a drug addict. How? He won't listen to me, Mia said with tears in her voice. What am I to him? A servant. He'll listen to you. I've divided everything I have in my will. Most of it goes to the children. Michael will get a lot too, provided he gets treatment, and he doesn't do anything like that for 3 years. Until then, he'll only get a monthly allowance and you'll get another share from me. Why me? I don't want anything. You don't have to look for another job, but you have to be there for him. That's a condition. Michael knows. Don't worry, I'm not going to control you. It wouldn't even occur to me. You have a head on your shoulders. You know our whole life and I have no one else to rely on. This will be your last job in Anne's family home. Understood? Now hand me my pills and go. I want to be alone. Mrs. Ann had to repeat her order one more time. There was no way Mia wanted to leave. She was afraid that the landlady, now that she had told her everything, might take her little white pills to kill herself. But everything went her way, and a month and a half later Mrs. Ann met the children calmly and quietly and said goodbye to them. Together with her agent, she planned her funeral down to the smallest detail. Mia was present for it. It must be the way royalty thinks things through. She'd said, I wish Michael had been there for the last hour, but it wasn't an hour. It was just the last night. One morning, Mrs. Ann did not wake up. In the days that followed, although the city's largest funeral parlor did take care of the arrangements, by evening Mia was so exhausted that she found it difficult to speak. Her tongue was slurring. Perhaps Chloe had been right to call her mother Mistress's dog. Mistress was gone, and Mia was doing the routine and making sure that the ceremony went as Mrs. Ann wished. Chloe must have learnt what had happened from Michael. She called her mother and carefully, as if stepping through a minefield, expressed her condolences. Mia accepted them discreetly. Chloe didn't ask if Mrs. Ann had left anything for her mother. It was probably already known. Chloe also didn't talk about her new hobby. And Mia didn't ask if her daughter was coming this summer, or if she would ever come at all. They said goodbye as strangers. Immediately after his wife's funeral, Michael went into rehab. He knew that otherwise he would lose his inheritance. But Mia wasn't sure of anything. Every treatment comes to an end sooner or later. Michael will be discharged. He will start hanging around the house again and looking for entertainment. There was no doubt he would eventually find some. Mia had a pretty good idea what kind. And with the money her landlady left her, Mia bought a house in the village, a big old house, a former manor house. She talked to drug addicts and found a few people who had quit and hoped to stay in that state as long as possible, preferably for the rest of their lives. Mia talked to each one and put together a team. She also found a woman named Jill. Outwardly, she was nothing special, a thin, petite, middle-aged blonde. But Jill had been working with people like that for a long time, and also Mia had never seen such a thing before. But on the example of her new acquaintance, she realized it was true. There are vampire people who naturally drink strength from you. Once you've been with one of those people, you leave like a squeezed lemon. And Jill radiated energy, gave it away generously, and everyone was always drawn to her. The women had a long conversation, clarified the nuances. The estate was far from the city. You could get to it by the only road. Every person was noticeable. If someone decides to remember old things, you can't bring anything here unnoticed. It would take everyone who settled in the manor to be engaged in healthy physical work. They're not bad people. And then everything should work out from there. Of course, you can't force anyone. And to live in such a commune or not is a voluntary matter. But someone will probably stay there for a long time. They'll have a vegetable garden, some animals. And Michael will always, every minute, be in front of Mia. 3 years. And both he and Mia will be free. He would get his money, and she would be free of the obligation to look after him. Mia caught herself reasoning already as a single person, thinking about what she would do when it was all over, and she would return to her parents' empty home, the ancestral nest, and calculate her pension so that it would be enough for everything, and probably sign up for the library. That's the way it would turn out one day. The old house was taking on a new life. It could be a museum, if someone had the will and the money, and if there were enough people to come and see the life of a 19th century landowner. Not a great poet, not a famous musician, but an ordinary man who loved his home and his fields. Mia stood on the first floor in the bay-windowed room she had chosen for herself. She looked out of the window and thought that the landowner must have had an office here, and he too looked out at the river meters away, at the willows leaning against the water, at the meadows. They were blooming now, and sweet to his heart. Mia had never allowed herself to be idle before. There was always something for her hands to do. But now Chloe, who had enough energy for two, was sure to take over. Jill enjoyed her new job, immersed in it with her head. She was the one who told Mia about the new residents of their little commune, and she had a kind word for everyone. Greg had worked all his life in the north, widowed, and thought he would live with his son's family and grandchildren. But his daughter-in-law first persuaded him to sell his northern shares and give them the money for a new car and repairs. Then she got him out of the flat and made him practically homeless. That's when Greg started drinking. Jill picked him up at some shelter. Then there's Tyler, a talented bard. He used to do a lot of gigs traveling, and afterwards, artists get a treat. At some point, Tyler realized he was losing his humanity. The tour was over. Even for himself, on his favorite guitar, he couldn't play. His fingers refused to obey. Tyler was in drug treatment. Jill picked him up right after he got out. Brandon could have grown up to be a good kid, kind, no matter what. But his mom brought in his stepdad, who drank and got his stepson hooked. Jill told these bitter stories with genuine pity for her charges. She wanted to protect the weak in spirit, to help them. Mia, on the other hand, had shunned such people all her long life. She didn't want to take on the burden of caring for them. Only now she began to look at those whom she called bottom dwellers, and thought that they would never get out of there. One day Mia told her friend about her own fate and asked with a chuckle, You would probably feel sorry for my husband and invite him to live here, wouldn't you? Jill thought for a few seconds and said, "No. If he abandoned his newborn daughter, did not even remember her, it is already hopeless. She wouldn't call, and if she came, she'd kick him out." Jill confirmed her words by breaking up with one of the tenants. Asking to take him to the village with her, Kyle swore that he was done with the bottle. A week later, Jill, returning from the shop, saw Kyle in the company of a local alcoholic. Both were quite pleased with the familiarity and companionship. When Jill told Kyle to pack his things in the morning, he tried to appeal to her pity. "Where am I going to go? I'm just going to sleep under a fence." "Go to someone you know." Jill cut him off. "His house is a wreck, but you'll fit in somehow. Don't doubt that alcoholic will welcome you with open arms. You'll be digging people's gardens, selling bottles. It's all right. You'll make a living." Mia, on the other hand, enjoyed the silence. And it wasn't just nature. There is no such thing as absolute silence in nature. At night, Mia woke up and took her time to go back to sleep. The window was open, and she listened to the nightingale singing, to the sound of a choir nearby. For the first time, she had the energy and time to do something other than continuous labor. When the foreman was called and he was installing a speaker in the house, Mia asked him what there was to see nearby. And the foreman, an old-timer of the area, began to tell her about the surrounding forests and lakes, where it is better to pick mushrooms, where to fish, and where it is better not to go. You might meet wild boars or accidentally step on an adder. You should talk to our forester. He would tell you so much, finished the master. He says that there are a lot of abnormal places here. True, he lives far away, on the cordon, but often comes to the forestry. Mia already knew where the forestry was. Not far from the center of the village there is a house under a roof, surrounded by old pine trees. The house is surrounded by a blank fence, on which someone had written graffiti "Animals are not food," and someone also crossed it out the next day with a bold cross. The woodsman's name is Will. Talk to him. Really, no one knows more about the area than he does. The first years of study at the Institute, Chloe was so fascinated by New York that she forgot about everything in the world. She told her friends and herself that she would never come home again, that here is her soul, her life. She even had the same pulse with New York. She couldn't believe herself that she hardly missed her mother at all. Student life, with so many interesting things to do, had swept over her head. And then, when Michael began to come, she didn't tell her mother about it, but she left the hostel just then and rented a flat on the outskirts of the city. But here it was far to get to the Institute, spent 2 hours on the way. And the girl moved closer to the center to a room in a communal flat. Michael gave money for everything, even for Chloe's mobile phone. The girl was really in love with him. Here he remained the last thread linking her to the house. But often come Michael could not, and gradually for Chloe his image lost clarity, became pale in comparison with her new acquaintances. So she befriended an artist who once in Central Park painted her portrait. He was Chloe's age. He had lived in New York all his life, and he showed the girl such places that she would not have discovered without him. The artist organized excursions on the rooftops, took Chloe to some bohemian bars, told her where Masons once gathered in New York. She told her friends that with him madly interesting, and she wanted to become like him, unusual, bright. She dyed her hair red. She got tattoos from her hands to her shoulders at the salon. She told Michael not to come again and to make it look thorough, remembering his dying wife, whom she had never thought of before. She knew that this was a real grief for Michael, that it was easier for him to feel like a wretch and torn between Mrs. Ann and her than to lose her, Chloe, forever. Chloe then fell ill with the very disease that the world either believes in or doesn't. The doctors said it wasn't that severe, that her young body could handle it. But Chloe did not turn to the doctors. She was lying in her room under the roof, and she had no strength to get out of bed. The sun did not look at her. The window looked out on the north side, a dull backyard, and Chloe had to look at the ceiling, count the cracks on it, and think that sometime before her this room lived. Probably the same poor student, or maybe a small clerk, a character of Edgar Poe. And he did not have enough money even for tea and sugar. The thoughts of tea were pressing. At first, Chloe didn't feel like eating at all. But when she began to recover, it turned out that there was not a crumb left in the house. and the girl could only get from the bed to the chair, sit for a while at the window, and drenched in sweat from weakness, back to bed. The painter did not come, afraid of the infection. In the end, Chloe was helped out by a neighbor, an old woman, God's dandelion. From time to time she went to the city, stood somewhere near the bridge and read by heart poetry classics. It was a way to supplement her pension. And also the old woman understood everything without words. She noticed that Chloe does not go anywhere, only to the toilet. So she made a judgment call. She crept to the door. Chloe opened it. "Little girl," said the old lady, "I'm going to the shop. Don't you need anything?" Chloe asked for tea, sugar, and a bun. She wanted to hug the old woman, but she was afraid to make her sick. The room was cold. Chloe drank hot tea, wrapped in a blanket. She wanted to go home for the first time. Mia decided to go to the distant lake they had just told her about. Everyone found something different there. Some people found beautiful views for photographs. Some people found scatterings of forest strawberries. Some people found solitude, a ringing silence. Going alone and orientated only on a satellite map was a bit scary. But Jill and her helpers were passionately engaged in the vegetable garden. It was a sin to distract her from such happiness. Mia walked through the meadow, which was in full bloom, across the bridge on its warm wooden planks. Beyond that was a road of concrete slabs, paved for who knows when and why. The grass was already thick between the slabs, and sometimes the concrete was lost in it. Mia was reminded of The Road to Nowhere, a book by Alexander Green that she had read as a child. Mia knew that she had gone far away from people already, and she didn't want to meet anyone, neither man nor beast. Because who could be more defenseless? An old woman who didn't even have a stick in her hand. And when she heard dry, like distant gunshots, sounds behind her, she turned round hurriedly. A rider was traveling along the same road, a man on a tall, naked horse. Mia hurriedly stepped to the side, giving way to him, but the stranger pulled on the reins and asked her, "Are you all right? Are you not lost?" She shrugged her shoulders. How can one get lost out here? She turned round tiredly and walked along the same slabs. There's only an abandoned village about 5 kilometers ahead. You're going that way, aren't you? Excuse me, but who are you to ask questions? He seemed surprised that he wasn't known. I'm going back home to the cordon. I'm the ranger here, Will. Mia nodded. I've been told about you. I even wanted to look you up if I could. Said no one knows the area better than you. Did you just move here? They walked side by side. Will was in a hurry and led the horse. Mia asked him what there was to see in the neighborhood. What's there to see? He answered her question with a question. The people here already know everything, and among the holiday makers there are more often amateur fishermen. They should first of all find out what and where they catch, and whether it is far from the lake, and whether it is possible to get there by car, and show on the map whether there are snakes there. And the most interesting thing is to tell children. Why? Will said. Because they just believe. They believe what I believe. It's a legendary land, really. They've even tried to explain it all scientifically. And what have you seen? Will glanced at her, as if checking to see if she was going to laugh. Sometimes there are paintings in the sky. The clouds get up like that, and the colors show up like that. So you look, and there's a bud above you. It's like a fantastic landscape. Another planet with purple seas, blue mountains and crimson rocks, like a mirage. And for a long time it stands there, doesn't move, doesn't disappear. Then I drop everything and look. There are caves here, connected by underground passages. They say they used to be home to bandits who robbed traveling merchants. There are some guys who climb these passages. They're hoping to find the treasure. They get lost and then I have to get them out. And then there's Soul Lake. It's like a small lake, and I don't show you the way to it, but only if you look into it. And it's not you reflected in the water, but your soul. Not always, but it happens. At some point in the conversation, Mia realized that she had long ago missed the turn to Lake Bright, which she had hoped to see. She stopped and gave Will her hand. If you're ever going to walk this far again, he said to her, come and see me at the cordon, and I'll tell you lots of other stories. Mia was used to the fact that here in the village a complete stranger might say hello to her in the street, and after a while there would be no strangers left. You go to the shop and you're bound to meet a dozen neighbors on the way. Now she began to meet Will. He came to the forestry farm several times a week, went on his motorbike, went on his horse, whose name was King. Will said he had no intention of getting a horse. But King's fate was too hard. His previous owners had kept him starved, beaten him with logs, and finally wanted to give him to the butchers. I said to them, "How much will you get for him?" "Skin and bones." "Sell him to me," so I bought him back. The horse was short-sighted back then, afraid of everything. You'd approach him, and he'd flee. He calmed down a bit at my cordon. We're friends now. But he'll never be the same again, trusting as he was. Will asked Mia to visit, and she did visit him at the cordon. It was a steep hike up a forested mountain. The two of them walked together, and Will kept Mia distracted from the hardships of the journey with conversation. But she still had to stop several times to catch her breath and gather her strength. Then the woods parted, revealing a sunlit clearing. Small birch trees grew there like grass, and there were lots of flowers. Mia felt ashamed that she knew the name of only a few of them, for these were her native places. And when she saw scatterings of wild strawberries, she couldn't resist picking them as she had done when she was a child, putting them in an improvised palm made of a fern leaf. Will's house was a big log house. Nearby, laundry dried on a rope and goats roamed. "I get a lot of visitors in the summer," Will said, "especially young guys who are interested in the paranormal. How many times they've told me that they lost their way, that their watch stopped on the way, that they walked and walked and walked, and came to a place they never expected to be. How do you feel about that?" "I've seen too much myself to laugh at them." "What do you do in the winter?" "I have a snowmobile. There's a village nearby where summer cottagers come in the summer, and in the winter, it's just old ladies. And if a grandmother gets sick, they put her in a big trough, hitch it to the snowmobile, and take her to the district center, where there is a hospital. They drank tea with herbs and fragrant honey." Mia realized that Will was spending too much time with her. No one would just treat a newcomer to the village like that. But she'd long ago stopped thinking of herself as a woman to look up to. A maid aunt she had read from someone about the wonderful phenomenon of aunts. These, waving to themselves, are individuals characterized by total self-denial, cleaning, lugging heavy bags from the shop, cooking, feeding everyone, and all for others. These ridiculous aunts, most often overweight, with short boyish haircuts that don't suit them, with wrinkles formed by a stern expression on their faces. And you won't be stern here in the fight against life. These aunts are the salt of the earth. They provide sustenance so that others can create, dream, and fulfill their dreams. Mia thought of herself as one of those aunts. And she thought that there was only one thing ahead of her old age, which it would be good to keep on her own feet, so as not to be a burden to people. And now Will calls her to come more often and walks her home, and brings gifts different from what Ben used to bring. A tincture to rub on her tired shoulders. Too much of her life had been on those shoulders, and the pain would go away in a flash. Or a berry patch. "I'll come round," Mia promised in surprise. Jill was deservedly proud of herself. She was finding work for her charges, and now they didn't have to sit on anyone's back. Surprisingly, there was an ostrich farm in this small village on the outskirts of the town, and Jill had placed some people to look after the huge birds. Jill knew that her charges had settled in the old house for good, that the lineup would change as well, but they needed a break from their old, unsettled, pain-filled lives. "We're having a labor and recreation camp here," Jill was saying. Mia had secretly feared when she'd brought Michael out here that he wouldn't last long. All that gardening wasn't for his fine hands. To her surprise, he never once asked to come back and kept himself busy, cutting grass, gathering wood for the bath. Surely he needed to feel that deadly fatigue by evening. It drove the thoughts away. And yes, Jill was right. The fatigue drowned out the pain. And then Michael arrived at Jill's house, unlike himself. He was glowing. "Chloe called me," Michael said. "She's coming, wants to spend the rest of the summer here." Mia, who had not been informed of her plans by her daughter, was cautious about the news. So what? Maybe she'll come with a friend of hers? With this artist they had long since parted. Chloe said that she missed me, asking me to come. Mia saw that Michael was ready to go to the city, despite the terms of the will, according to which he was obliged to obey her. "Go," she said. "Tell your daughter I love her, and I'm always waiting for her." The day after Michael left, Mia went to visit Will. She didn't warn him of her visit and went alone. It was okay if she didn't catch the woodsman at home. She would wait for him. And yet, how is he not afraid to live so far away from people? If something happens, how can he explain to the ambulance where to go? And would a car get there on these trails? Immersed in her own thoughts, Mia didn't realize whether she was going the right way. Had she lost her way? Then she definitely woke up. The forest surrounded her, and there seemed to be grass mown and some semblance of a path looping around. Scolding herself with the last words who would look for her now. The fool. Mia followed the trail and suddenly froze when a small lake opened up in front of her. Its banks were thickly overgrown and by the looks of it marshy. It was only possible to approach the water to where she now stood. At the very edge of the water lay a flat, large rock. Mia was hot, and she wanted to dip her hands into the water and then rub her face with them, which were cold. So she stepped onto the rock and leaned out into the lake and froze. The water was very dark, almost black, and it reflected everything: the sky with its high cumulus clouds, the tops of the trees, and Mia herself. Only it was not a tired middle-aged woman, but a young girl, a lush braid the color of ripe rye hanging over her shoulder, a clear oval face. It was the way she had once been and still was in old photographs, and beautiful, large, and a little frightened eyes. The girl reflected in the water was a beauty. Life had not yet turned her into a fiery horse, had not tormented her with deceit and disappointments. This girl believed in goodness and waited for love. For a long time, Mia looked at her own reflection. Gradually, she began to identify herself with the one who at first seemed a stranger to her. It seemed to her that even the expression on the girl's face was changing. Mia was wrong. Life looked at her from the dark water with the eyes of the one who had withstood everything, who had not broken, and who still had the same eyes full of inner light. And she became even more beautiful. "We have a lake here, and if you look into it, you'll see your soul." Mia remembered Will's words. So it was her soul, then. She plunged her hands into the water, either trying to touch the girl or hoping the magical water would heal her fatigue. The hands of Mia and the one reflected made contact. And Mia remembered that long-forgotten feeling of youth, when life seems like a miracle. And that miracle belongs to you, and you can handle anything. You own the whole world. When Mia walked away from the lake, she somehow immediately came to the right path that led to the cordon. But there was still a long way to go. She walked on, picking flowers. They weren't pretty, but they smelled so strongly of honey that they made her dizzy. She came to Will's house with a large bouquet. No one was at the cordon, but it looked as if the owner had been away for a while and would be back soon. On the kitchen table was a plate of chunks of fish and flour. Mia lit the cooker, put on a frying pan, and began to fry the fish. The fins were turning golden, and the crispy pieces were covered with a smoky crust. What a marvelous aroma! Will returned to the cordon with a strange feeling that someone was there. He had lived alone for many years. A long time ago he had been married, but the marriage hadn't lasted a few years. Olivia couldn't stand living in the middle of nowhere. She wanted to go back to the city. Maybe if she found the right words, he'd drop everything. But Olivia put up with it for a long time, and then she made a scene, calling him a recluse and a loser. She packed her things and told Will she wouldn't come back, even if he crawled to town on his knees. From then on, only brave tourists who were not afraid to climb into the heart of these woods came to his cordon. The feeling that someone was here was growing stronger, even though the front lawn was empty. Will hurriedly stepped onto the porch and opened the door. Mia paced barefoot in the kitchen, humming and frying fish. "I've had enough of your sluggish Vanka," objected by disgruntled wife. MP4. Caroline and Michael had known each other since high school. The young man was a few years older, so at that time he didn't consider her a young schoolgirl at all. Caroline, on the other hand, looked at him every time she saw him. Once she even dared to confess her feelings to him. Michael was very pleased by this act, but it did not cause any mutual feelings. He did not take Caroline's words seriously, as he thought it was just a childish crush. At that time, Caroline considered herself a very mature girl who was in the 8th grade at that time. She believed that she and Michael had a small age difference, and somewhere in her heart she hoped that he would invite her to his graduation. However, time passed, and the young man still continued to remain silent. And then Caroline decided to come to his graduation on her own in the hope that when he saw her, his heart would immediately inflame with love. Then she packed like it was her prom night. She spent all her saved money on a new dress that would resemble a princess dress. A classmate had given her beautiful hair and makeup. Even though Caroline was in 8th grade, she already looked like a beautiful formed woman. Her breasts and hips were rounded and her waist was slim. When Caroline put on her dress and walked up to the mirror, she couldn't take her eyes off herself. The red silk floor-length dress with open shoulders sat perfectly on her figure. Brown curls fell over her shoulders and chest. Her friend paid special attention to Caroline's eyes. She decided to emphasize them with such a makeup technique as smoky eye. This look made Caroline feel a little more grown up. She no longer looked like a little girl. In front of the mirror stood a beautiful young woman. When it was time to go out, Caroline felt a little nervous, so she decided to take her friend Emma with her, who did her makeup and hair. The girls walked to school holding hands. Emma kept telling Caroline that she looked ravishing, and today she would get her Michael. At the school, the girls saw a huge number of people who had gathered to watch the graduation farewell number. The girls' classmates and parents were there. Caroline didn't care who was around her. Her eyes were constantly on the lookout for Michael. She wanted him to see her as soon as possible and give her a few compliments. When the girl realized that her lover was nowhere to be found, she decided to go around the school. She knew that high school students gathered around the corner to smoke. That's where she headed. As she neared the corner of the building, she saw Michael with his strong, masculine arms around some girl she didn't know. Could it be a sister? No, it can't be. Never would a brother hug his sister like that. And what does he see in her? Why doesn't he notice me at all? Who have I been trying for? Caroline thought. The girl didn't know what she should do. On the one hand, she really wanted to appear from around the corner, to come up to Michael, to congratulate him on graduation. But on the other hand, she realized that she wouldn't be welcome. The two of them had run away from everyone to cuddle here. So they didn't want to see anyone. Tears came to her eyes, and there was such a squeezing feeling in her chest that it was very hard to breathe. Caroline couldn't do anything about her emotions, so she picked up the hem of her dress in her hands and ran out of the schoolyard as fast as she could. At this time, Emma stood in the square and searched for her friend with her eyes. Emma, at some point, even started to feel worried because her friend had been gone for quite a long time. In the distance, she saw the silhouette of Caroline running as hard as she could. Fear lurked inside that something was wrong, and Emma ran after her. Caroline. Wait, Emma shouted at the top of her voice. Stop, I said. The girl grabbed Caroline's arm, turning around to face her. What happened? Nothing. It's just business as usual, Emma said in a frustrated voice. I don't understand why I thought Michael would ever pay attention to me. What makes you think that? Maybe because you're a very pretty girl, Emma said. Tell me what happened. I was just looking for him. I remembered that he and the boys often went behind the school to smoke. When I got to the corner, I saw him hugging some girl. You know, it's just some other girl. Why her and not me? I'm always in front of him, trying to look pretty. I even confessed my feelings to him. He couldn't even take it seriously. Tell me, do I look like I'm joking? First of all, Caroline, there's nothing wrong with you. I never thought your feelings for Michael could be fake or a joke. If you didn't realize that, then you have to think about the fact that he's a fool. Well, only a fool would miss a girl like you. Secondly, I can only assume that Michael didn't take you seriously because we're 3 years younger. Maybe when we're 25 and he's 28, the difference won't be so obvious. I'm asking you not to feel bad, because there will be men in our lives that Michael can't even match. Don't you dare say that. You don't know him at all. Do you know what a kind, sweet, decent, funny, strong, manly man he is? I could go on and on about him forever. You can talk about him your whole life, but it won't change the fact that he's cuddling with some girl right now, Emma said, realizing that the words would hurt her friend. Caroline's face changed instantly, and tears came to her eyes again. She felt like Emma had betrayed her. If they were true friends, she wouldn't have done this and would have continued to support Caroline all the way until Michael was hers forever. But instead, her friend talks about how the young man is not worthy of her love. How can you say that about people you don't know at all? Caroline couldn't understand it at all. There was nothing to do, so the friends packed up and went home. On the way, they discussed plans for the evening. Emma didn't want to leave her friend alone with bad thoughts, so she offered to go home with her. Caroline accepted the offer. The girls entered the flat. Emma immediately went to the bathroom to wash off her holiday makeup and get rid of her hair, which reminded her of today's mishap. As soon as Caroline transformed from a beautiful girl to a young wench, she and Emma went straight to the cafe to really devour the ice cream. Despite this, it had been a lovely evening. Caroline was constantly dangling in the clouds and thinking about how she would go on without her lover, knowing that he was in love with some other girl. For about a fortnight, Caroline had been constantly thinking about Michael. It couldn't be said that she enjoyed suffering. In her dreams, she imagined the young man coming into her room in the middle of the night, lying down in bed and holding her in his arms. On top of that, she constantly had dreams in which Michael would whisper his love to her, talk about how beautiful she was, and make excuses about those hugs with the girl. Caroline wanted it to be that way. She had seen her lover a few times at the mall, and when she had said hello to him, she had heard a short, "Hey babe," in response. After saying that, she wanted to cry because she realized that you can't say hello like that to someone you have a soft spot for. At some point, Caroline realized that Michael wasn't interested in her at all. She felt hurt that her friend Emma was right in what she said. Emma felt very sorry for Caroline. She tried to distract the girl from the bad thoughts that constantly visited her head, thought up a variety of activities for the evening. And at some point, Emma realized that she had succeeded in achieving what she wanted. Caroline thought of Michael less and less every day. And then she forgot he even existed. Well, at least that's how it seemed to Emma. The next 3 school years flew by quickly and easily because Michael was no longer in school, and Caroline didn't see him. She went about her business and socialized with her peers. The girl was no longer dangling in the clouds. She had no time, as she had to prepare for exams. They heard that Michael, after graduating from school, entered some institute, which was in another city. Because of that, they had never even met him in their small town. Emma looked at Caroline and couldn't believe that such a great love had left no trace. Not only had her friend stopped thinking about Michael, but she had started dating other guys. Each time, Caroline thought that this was her only love that would go with her all her life. However, the young men were dishonest. Each wanted only one thing from Caroline. All as one swore their love while trying to get under her skirt. Caroline was not ready for this and constantly broke up with them, refusing the young men. She talked about taking things slow, but they wouldn't listen to her. Each lover said that if Caroline did not agree to intimacy, then she did not love him. Each of them tried to make her feel guilty. To be honest, they succeeded. Sometimes the girl was on the verge of agreeing. However, at the last moment, she would change her mind. When Caroline stopped being so naive, she realized that she was being manipulated. The most frustrating thing was that, in her opinion, only she had grown up, not her surroundings. This was because each of her suitors made the mistakes of the previous one. It seemed as if they all stopped at the same level of development. It was then that Caroline decided that she would die an old maid. She had come to the conclusion that no man in this town was worthy of her. Emma was both happy about that decision and worried about Caroline. You and I are adults, so we should react differently to fools. Look, Caroline, you've heard it said many times that men are 3 years behind women in their development. That says you should pick an older guy, and you're still messing around with our 1-year-olds. I was walking to school the other day, and I saw Jeff beating nettles with a stick and laughing like a little kid. What can you talk about with people like that? Emma, I get it. Yeah, I've heard that you should pick a guy who's older than you, but I picked one once before. And if you remember, it didn't work out so well. Honey, there's going to be a lot more fools in your life. That's no reason to stigmatize every guy. Okay, Emma, let's put this conversation on hold. I promise you I will not die an old maid. I'm just going to try to get away from all of this right now. And do well, Caroline said with a smile, hugging her friend. That's a different conversation. I thought you were going to get depressed because of the fools. Well, on that positive note, let's go get some delicious ice cream, Emma said in a cheerful voice. Caroline felt as if she would never be able to love anyone as much as Michael in her life. Even though she didn't remember him anymore, she still had that feeling in her chest. She had to take her final exams ahead of her, which at the moment was causing her difficulties. She had been sitting all evenings at her textbooks and solving problems in her hated maths. Caroline was very tired. She could afford to take a walk with her friend on rare free evenings or only on weekends. Such time was especially valuable because she was able to distract herself from all the thoughts that haunted her. As the end of the school year drew nearer, Caroline began to worry. Sometimes it seemed to her that she would fail all her exams and would have to go to a vocational school. Frankly, that was her biggest fear. Her parents always had high hopes for her, so she tried to never let them down. On the days when she had to take her final exams, Caroline remembers only the moments when she entered the classroom as a blur in her mind. After that, it was like she was in a vacuum. God only knows how she solved all the problems and wrote the essays. However, despite such great anxiety and excitement, the girl managed to pass the exams with good and excellent marks. These results were enough to enter the Polytechnic University. By that time, Caroline had not yet had time to decide on a specialty, and therefore went to study only to have a diploma of higher education in her hands. She realized that in the future she would in any case receive additional education when she could decide on the profession she wanted to work in for the rest of her life. In her first year, Caroline was very sad that her only best friend Emma had left for the regional city. She was used to her friend always being around and being able to come over at any moment. However, now they only saw each other a few times a month when Emma came to her hometown for the weekend. Despite this, Caroline had developed quite a good relationship with her classmates. Caroline herself did not expect that she could become one of the most popular girls in the institute. One day she was preparing for her maths class. She quickly read through the notes to refresh her knowledge when she suddenly heard someone calling her from behind. Turning round, she was taken aback. "Swan, is that you?" Smiling broadly, Michael, who was standing a metro away from her, said. Caroline could not believe her eyes. In front of her stood a ghost from the past, which had completely discouraged the girl from believing in true and pure love. She felt both joy and anger at the same time. She was ready even now to throw herself on his neck, to kiss him and tell him how much she loved him all these years. And at the same time, she wanted to hit him for coming to ruin her life again. "Why don't you say something? Standing up like a stranger. Have you forgotten how you told me how much you loved me?" "That was a long time ago, and it wasn't true." "Hello, Michael. I heard you were studying in some other city. How did you end up at our institute?" Caroline asked with coldness in her voice. "I missed our town. I decided to transfer in my final year. It's the same specialty. The teaching here is no worse than in the region." "Well, to be honest," Michael said in a calm tone. The bell rang in the building, signaling the start of classes. Caroline started to get ready, but Michael grabbed her arm and asked her a question. "Maybe after school we could have coffee in the square across the street." Caroline was numb to the suggestion. She wanted to hit the young man to make him feel the way she did more than 3 years ago. She couldn't do that because somewhere in the back of her mind all these years she had dreamed of meeting him. Then she decided to take a chance and say yes. Just after the end of the pairs, Caroline was coming down the stairs and saw Michael waiting for her in the lobby. He was talking to some upperclassmen. They were smiling and gesticulating vigorously. For some reason, Caroline felt afraid. She thought that if she approached Michael now, he would decide to laugh at her. However, when the young man looked up at her, he smiled broadly and waved his hand for her to approach him as quickly as possible. "Were those my classmates?" Michael said, smiling. "Shall we go for a walk?" Caroline nodded affirmatively, and the young man headed for the park. He bought them each a cup of coffee. To be honest, Caroline didn't like the drink, but she didn't want to contradict Michael. He talked a lot about studying at the institute in another city, about student parties. Caroline walked beside him and listened as if mesmerized. She didn't care what he was talking about. It was enough that he was near and occasionally touched her palm with his fingers. "You've changed a lot," Michael said with a smile. "No, you used to be quite beautiful too. It's just that, in my mind, you're still the one who used to confess her feelings to me." "Well, I wasn't that young," I was 14, by the way, Caroline said. Yes, Michael, those were bright feelings. My first love as a teenager, in fact, it was my last. I mean, really. Are you telling me you haven't had a boyfriend in all these years? What do you take me for? Sure, I tried to date different young men, but at some point I realized I was doing something wrong. It was like they were all left living at the age they were when they were 7 or 8 years old. After a few weeks, I realized that this wasn't my option at all. So we broke up. In the 11th grade, I was completely desperate and just decided to devote all my time to studying and preparing for exams. Why did all those guys annoy you so much? Every one of them was trying to get under my skirt. When I got rejected, they tried to accuse me of not being sincere in my feelings. In their opinion, if I liked them, I should have jumped into bed with them on the very first day, and I didn't like that, so I stopped talking to them and getting to know them. So you mean to say that such a beautiful, glamorous girl has never had a boyfriend? Michael asked, smiling broadly. He shook his head a little and corrected himself. I'm sorry, that was a tactless question. All right, we're not 15 years old. Yeah, I've never been with anyone. To be honest, I don't regret it. I think it's better to wait a while and break your virginity with someone you really care about. Did you already have someone in your life that you cared about? Michael asked with an awkward smile. Yes, but as they say, there was one and then there was one. Okay, let's change the subject. I feel a little awkward. I just don't even know why you're interested in this. I'm interested because when I saw you, my heart sank. I had no idea a pretty girl like you had no one. But even so, I'm ready to make it up to you. And how would you do that? Caroline was puzzled and really didn't understand what Michael was talking about. Despite the fact that at the beginning of their conversation she felt free and uninhibited, now she was stiff. Her heart began to beat in a frantic rhythm. Her palms began to sweat. Don't you have any idea? I was just wondering if I was the person you cared about. There's a reason you confessed your feelings to me. Maybe I was careless at the time, but I don't blame myself for that. You realize it was the age you were at, and in fact you looked very small to me. So I thought, why don't you and I start dating? See if it could work out. It's just, I haven't really had much of a personal life over the years. Honestly, I don't even know why. Most of the girls were easygoing and pretty stupid. Over the years, I've realized that those are not the qualities I'm attracted to in the opposite sex. And you, as I recall, are a very intelligent and well-read girl. Caroline stood in a stupor and just couldn't believe her ears. After all these years, Michael had noticed her and asked her out. At the same time, he didn't talk about any of his impossibly big feelings. It was a shame that he assumed they could have been a good match. She wished he would be speechless at the sight of her. Why are you looking at me like that? Michael asked, smiling broadly. Look, but we're adults. I promise I won't hit on you. Let's give it a try. What if we really do make it work? Now, I could ask myself the basic question of whether you like me. But I know it's going to stump you, and you won't be able to answer it because you don't think there's a right answer. If you answer in the negative, then you're lying to me. And if you answer in the affirmative, it could mean you're horny for me. Well, right? Michael was right about everything. In fact, if he had asked that question, Caroline wouldn't have been able to answer it. Two opposing feelings were battling inside her. On the one hand, it was the all-encompassing love that had made her refuse to meet and date men all these years. And on the other hand, it was the resentment of the same girl who in the 8th grade saw her lover in the arms of another. In addition, Caroline noticed that the young man's conceit was quite overstated. It made her want to put him down a little, but she loved him so much that she agreed to his proposal. And it had really worked out. Michael and Caroline started seeing each other every day. They walked in parks, went to cafes, to cinemas. The girl felt really happy and thanked God that he brought them together again. Caroline was a rather mature, pragmatic girl, so she did not put big bets on this relationship. It seemed to her that they wouldn't last more than a few months. She had prepared herself in advance for a negative outcome, but despite all this, she enjoyed the time they spent together. Caroline's assumptions were not confirmed. No one realized what Michael and Caroline could possibly have in common. But despite this, they loved and enjoyed each other against all odds. The girl was very jealous of her lover, since so many girls in the institute looked at him. Michael was a little amused by such a reaction of his girlfriend. He was not going to cheat on her, and she realized it herself. Caroline could not charge Michael with anything, but she was not averse to pulling out the hair of her rivals. The young man very beautifully courted his girlfriend, gave a variety of gifts, arranged surprises. Before that, he lived by the principle that a woman loves ears, so he very often told his beloved compliments. Caroline seemed to melt from his words. To tell the truth, she was ready to give herself to him from the very first day of their relationship. However, the first intimacy happened 6 months later. It was the most unforgettable night for Caroline. Michael turned out to be a very tender and sensual lover. To a large extent, he cared not about his own pleasure, but about the pleasure of his partner. Then Caroline thought that such a night would never happen again. However, she was wrong. Michael loved her just as much, and sometimes even hotter than the first time. More than anything, Caroline wanted to tell someone about it, but she regretted that all this time she had never been able to make any real friends. Emma still continued to be her only support and encouragement. Although she lived in another city, the girl had to live alone with her feelings and emotions, although she wanted to shout to the whole world about her happiness and love. After graduation, Michael went to work in a famous office programmer. At the start, he received a little, but every year his income became more and more. When he already realized that he could provide not only for himself, but also for his family, he proposed to Caroline to move in together. The girl immediately agreed. Although inside her lurked fear, she was afraid to a greater extent. She was not afraid of a common life, and that the joint life will make her miss her studies. Michael was very persuasive and promised that he would help her with all the household chores. He kept his promise. After work, he came home and did not scold his wife if the food was not ready, was always ready to help to wash dishes, take out the rubbish, sweep up. On the one hand, it seems that these are so simple tasks that take up little time, but however, sometimes Caroline had neither time nor energy for them. During the last days of her studies, Caroline spent more and more time in the library. She had a thesis to write, but the atmosphere at home made it hard for her to concentrate. Sometimes she forgot about the time and only came to her senses when the staff told her that the library would be closing soon. Then she would run out of the building and find Michael standing there waiting for her. "When I got home from work and realized you weren't here yet, I came straight here," he said with a smile. "Somehow I guessed you were here. Please forgive me. I got so caught up in my thesis that I lost track of time," Caroline said with a guilty look. "Baby, you have nothing to apologize for. I've been through this phase before, and I know how important it is to write a good thesis," Michael replied. "I give you complete freedom. Use as much time as you need. This period won't last forever. We'll manage." Michael spoke softly in his beloved's ear, hugging her tightly. The day of the thesis defense was approaching inexorably fast. Caroline's nerves were failing and she began to take sedatives. However, each day they helped less and less. When the day came to hand in the diploma, she was completely disintegrated. From early morning, Michael tried to cheer her up and promised that in the evening of the same day she would have a big surprise. "You won't pass, sweetheart. You can't fail. You wrote this paper yourself and you'll have no trouble answering all the extra questions. Just believe in yourself. Imagine all the hard work you've done. You can't just give up. What's more, you said yourself that you don't care about the grade you get. So why do you care? You can't get out with a certificate. That can only happen if you keep your mouth shut and don't say a word. Come on, wake up. I've got to go to work. I was going to ask you to leave for today, but I decided that I won't distract you from your diploma. So I just want you to call me when it's over." "Okay, of course, you're my nearest and dearest. I love you. Have a good day, honey," Caroline said with tenderness in her voice and hugged her beloved. When Caroline came to the institute, she was horrified to find out that she would be the first to defend her thesis. After this information, her stomach immediately cramped and nausea set in. How to calm her anxiety, she had no idea. She had already taken 2 pills of sedatives up to this point. She was afraid to increase the dosage, as she might overdose. The girl could swear on everything she had, but she absolutely did not remember the moment when she defended her diploma. Everything was like a blur. The members of the examination committee asked Caroline a few additional questions, which she successfully answered. Now she had to wait for all her classmates to speak and find out her grade. Even though she didn't remember her performance at all, her excitement was gone. She didn't worry about anything anymore. She was only interested in what surprise Michael would give her this evening. About 2 hours later, Caroline learned that she had received an excellent grade for her thesis defense. She was overjoyed. She immediately dialed her lover and shared this wonderful news. "You see, baby, I told you everything would be fine. I'm so happy for you. I'm so happy for you. Do you realize you're about to start a new phase of your life? It's going to be a real adult life. I was worried about you." "Let's make an appointment," Michael said. After that, he told Caroline that he would wait for her right after his work in one of the shopping centers. The girl assumed that this way they would celebrate her graduation from university. Perhaps they would go shopping, or maybe they would go to some restaurant. And Caroline did not know how to dress properly, so she chose something more solemn. Finished with her makeup, she immediately hailed a taxi to go to the meeting place. As she pulled up, Caroline noticed Michael standing at the entrance with a bouquet of flowers. They were her favorite daisies. The girl adored the wildflowers, their fragrance that filled the whole room, and how long they stood in the vase. The young man gave his beloved a bouquet, hugged and kissed her tenderly. "You look just amazing. How did you know that I would invite you to the restaurant?" Michael asked. "Are we going to a restaurant?" Caroline asked with feigned surprise. "Of course I couldn't leave my favorite girl without a party. It's your day, and it's all about you," Michael replied. The young people headed to the shopping center and went to one of the best restaurants in the city. It was located on the top floor. The distinctive feature was the panoramic roof. It was especially beautiful here at dark, with stars peering out and winking from every direction. Caroline especially liked the fact that the restaurant had a lot of live plants, while most of the competitors used only artificial ones. It gave a special cozy atmosphere. After a delicious dinner, Michael asked the waiter to bring dessert. Caroline objected, talking about the fact that not a single gram of food would fit into her anymore. However, the young man was very persistent. The girl gave in and ordered her favorite tiramisu. When the waiter brought their order, Caroline told Michael about something carefree and did not notice anything around her. As soon as she remembered the dessert, she immediately picked up the spoon to break off a piece and put it in her mouth. However, her hand froze a few centimeters away from the plate. In the center of the dessert, in a turret of whipped cream, was a beautiful ring with a large stone. Michael wanted to wait for any reaction from her, however, she was afraid to even move. The young man noticed the coming tears in her eyes and immediately got off his seat and got down on his knee. "My sweet and dear Caroline, we have been together for a long time. I am grateful to fate for bringing us together all these years. My only regret is that back then, when you were 14 years old, I didn't believe your words when you spoke of your feelings for me. I am so sorry that we lost so many years. I'll be honest, I was purposely waiting for that moment when you graduated from the institute. Now I want to ask you one thing. Will you marry me?" "Yes, yes, of course, yes," exclaimed Caroline to the whole restaurant and jumped up to hug her husband. All around, all the customers applauded, began whistling, congratulating the young couple. "You are the man of my life. I fell in love with you as a little girl and I continue to love you. Only my love grows stronger every day. I love you, my good man," replied Caroline. "You see how it turned out. A few years ago you didn't want to start dating me. I remember. Somehow you doubted that our relationship would last. Somehow I was already convinced that we'd be together forever." It was the second happiest day of Caroline's life. We decided not to postpone the wedding, and the next day we went to the registry office and filed an application. The date of marriage registration was set in a month. This suited the young people, as they did not want a lavish celebration. To Caroline's surprise, even after the wedding, their relationship had not changed at all. They were still as close and loved each other. The newlyweds always indulged in love at the first opportunity. When Caroline told her friend Emma about it, she expected her friend to be happy for them. However, Emma always asked some uncomfortable questions and demanded answers. "How can you talk so excitedly about sex with your husband when you haven't tried it with anyone else? Tell me, don't you just feel bad that you married your first man? I, for one, could never do that. You should have found another man after he proposed to you. You have to compare the two, you know." Caroline was very hurt by such words. She didn't understand her friend's consumerist attitude towards men. The girl was completely satisfied with their intimate life with her husband. How can you have sex with someone else if you love and want only one, she thought. What pleased her most was the fact that Michael always proved to be unresponsive. He was only too happy to be in bed with his favorite woman. So Michael and Caroline lived for 3 years. And after that, in the life of a young man, there was a tragedy that changed his life completely. One of the days on his phone received a call. When Michael answered it, his face immediately contorted with a grimace of grief. Caroline stared at him without taking her eyes off him. At that moment, she still didn't understand what had happened and couldn't help him properly. The young man continued to hold the phone to his ear, and tears welled up in his eyes at that moment. His jaw was clenched, and it showed that he was trying his best to fight all his emotions. If Caroline hadn't been there, he probably would have slumped to the floor like a 5-year-old, but he wasn't used to showing weakness, especially in front of the woman he loved, and he couldn't fight his emotions. "Michael, what's wrong? Who called you? Are you nervous?" Caroline asked. She had no idea what could cause her husband such emotions. The hospital called. Grandma's dead. The phone fell out of Michael's hands and shattered. When he said out loud what he had heard, he couldn't contain his emotions, and he cried. Caroline didn't know much about Michael's relatives, but she had heard about his grandmother. That woman had replaced both his parents and his friends. While still in school, they often saw each other. However, after entering the institute, meetings became much less frequent. But despite this, Michael called his beloved grandmother every 2 days, asking how she was doing, whether she needed any help. Just a few months ago, he went to her to help with the city, since she at her age was no longer coping. The girl was indignant that such a misfortune had befallen a loved one of her favorite man. Recently, the grandmother did not complain about her health, only saying that it was already much harder for her to carry buckets and dig beds. No one paid much attention to that, because at her age it was already a good thing that she was getting around on her own. Caroline wanted to ask Michael as many questions as she could to understand fully what had happened. However, she couldn't find the right words. She waited patiently for her husband to come to his senses so that he could tell her everything himself. The hospital called. My grandmother had been hit by a lorry, Michael began to say after he had calmed down. They tried to save her, but they couldn't. It turned out that the only shop in their village had closed, and she had gone to a neighboring one to buy groceries. As she was crossing the motorway, she didn't see the moving lorry. "God, I'm in so much pain. I don't understand how all this could have happened," Michael said as he relived the tragedy. She lived to her years. She felt normal. Yes, she got weaker, but that's normal for her age. How could such a ridiculous accident, take the life of a beautiful person? "I'm alone now." "What are you talking about? Why are you alone?" Caroline tried to reassure her beloved husband. "At least you have me, and at most you have your beloved. You've got your friends, your parents." "Yeah, I've got you, I guess, and all my friends one day and gone the next. My parents never needed me. They gave me to my grandmother from the day I was born. She was the only person on this planet whom I loved with all my heart and soul, and was grateful for everything she did for me. I don't know how to move on." Pain settled in Caroline's soul. The feeling was brought on by Michael's words. She was hurt because he was talking about how Grandma was the only person he loved and was grateful to. Didn't she deserve the same words for herself? Caroline silently tried to reassure her spouse as she inwardly nurtured all these questions that were popping up in her head. She had done a lot for them too. She too had tried and loved him with all her heart and soul over the years. The girl realized that this jealousy was unfounded. One should never be jealous of one's loved one's relatives, much less the dead. She hoped that Michael would need at most a few weeks to come to his senses and return to his former state. She tried not to bring up topics that would make her spouse feel heartache again. Michael tried to keep his cool, too. He didn't want to show his wife the weakness that overcame him. Every day he tried to put on a smile and make himself look carefree. And perhaps he was even succeeding. However, inside he was burning resentment at this imperfect world. To others, their couple had not changed in any way. They still looked loving and happy. And only the sadness in Michael's eyes gave away his real state. Caroline was also glad that her beloved husband was slowly returning to his old life. And everything seemed to be the same as before. However, the girl noticed that there had been no intimacy between them for a long time. After this realization, Caroline wanted to meet her husband after work as usual in beautiful lace lingerie and a silk dressing gown, but after a little thought, she decided that it would be inappropriate. If at this point Michael had a desire to make love to his wife, he would have had it long ago. However, he was being passive. And then Caroline decided not to touch him for the 40 days that are set aside for mourning. When that period had passed, nothing had changed. Everything remained the same. Michael lived a monotonous life. He came to work, completed his tasks, and went home. At home, there was a delicious and hot dinner waiting for him, after which he and Caroline would fall on the sofa and they would watch TV. And it was always like that. Caroline was getting nervous that she couldn't get what she wanted from her beloved Michael. She had become much more affectionate in her grooming of her spouse, wagging her tail like a sly fox. But except for his kind, sweet smile, she received nothing. Because of the lack of intimacy, the girl began to think that Michael had a mistress. Michael was much harder than it seemed. The fact is that immediately after receiving the news of his grandmother's death, he began to notice various changes in his body. His appetite decreased many times over. There were days when he ate nothing at all, because his stomach did not want to take it. Periodically, those around him noticed that his eye was twitching. From the look of it, many people thought he was nervous. Although he was in a calm state, his hands would also shake periodically, as in Parkinson's disease. But there was another problem that bothered Michael the most. It was that he had stopped wanting his wife. No, he would have phrased the problem differently. He had stopped wanting any kind of intimacy with women. His body did not react in any way to the beautiful curves of Caroline's body, which used to be so desirable that he could not contain himself. What frightened the young man was what he realized Caroline was waiting for him to act. One had to be a fool not to realize that the girl did not undertake any manipulation, just because of the fact that there was grief in the family of her beloved. She waited as long as she needed to. And all the while, Michael hoped that his body would start working again like it used to. However, the days passed inexorably fast, but nothing changed. The young man realized that Caroline's patience was not infinite. Sooner or later, she would have the conversation he wanted to avoid. That's when Michael got the idea to see a doctor. He didn't like going to the doctor, even when he was really sick. Right now, he didn't feel at all like telling a stranger about his problems, even though he might be able to help. It was too intimate for Michael, but he couldn't find any other way out. When Michael entered the doctor's office, he began to absent-mindedly shuffle from foot to foot. The doctor was used to this reaction of men, so he calmly invited him to sit down. "You understand, if you keep quiet, I won't be able to help you," the doctor spoke after several minutes of Michael's silence. He understood how difficult it was for all these men to talk about problems. However, the appointment was on time and the queue could not be delayed. Michael took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and blurted it out. He realized that his lack of desire was entirely due to the stress he had received. That's why he immediately spoke about the situation. As he talked, he sat with his eyes closed the whole time, ashamed to open them and look at the doctor. "Michael, listen to what I can tell you," the doctor began to speak after he had gathered the history. "I don't think you need to worry about your situation, as this reaction of the body to stress is considered quite normal. You know, I used to think so too, but it's been quite some time now. The functions haven't all returned. If this had happened a week ago, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I think the problem is more serious than you're describing." Michael began to object to the doctor's words. No, I assure you, you don't have to worry about anything. Most people tend to think that these reactions should resolve themselves within a week or two. But there are cases where the dysfunction can persist for months, or even years, the doctor said. "I am a married man, and I understand your situation and your worries. The only thing I can advise you at the moment is to take special pills before sexual intercourse. But these same drugs are not a cure. They were created by scientists for old people." "I'm still 30 years old," Michael objected. "No. And you're suggesting that I fulfill my marital duty with these pills? I'm beginning to question your qualifications." Michael was getting nervous because this was not the help he had hoped for. "Believe me, if I wasn't qualified, I wouldn't be here," the doctor said. "If you want to speed up the recovery process, you should also take a course of anti-anxiety medication. If you have not regained function after such a time, it means that inside you are still experiencing the loss of your loved one. This is normal, but sometimes it crosses all boundaries of reason." The doctor wrote Michael a prescription. "Now, these are the pills you'll need to buy at the pharmacy. The last ones on the list will help you feel like a real man in bed with your wife. Michael snatched the prescription from the doctor's hands, did not say goodbye, and quickly left the office. This was not the kind of help he had hoped for. Walking to the nearest public garden, the man took out his phone and went online. He was convinced that he could do himself more good by self-medication than by these pills prescribed by the doctor. On one of the internet pages, Michael saw an advertisement for a special dietary supplement for male strength, relatively inexpensive, and from the reviews it was clear that it is completely safe and cannot harm the body, as it contains only natural components. For Michael, this drug turned out to be a real salvation. He was sure that after it immediately all functions would be restored. Therefore, he immediately placed an order. Now it was only necessary to wait. Managers warned Michael that the dietary supplement would be delivered within a week. The man did not think that the delivery would take so long, so he began to worry. All this time, Caroline had been hanging around him like a fox. He didn't know how to get away from her. Michael came up with various excuses, in the truthfulness of which sometimes he himself did not believe. His nerves were on edge, and at that moment Michael decided to use his doctor's prescription to buy anti-anxiety medication. He did this furtively from his wife, so that she did not think that he had any problems, as the young man constantly pretended that his life was fine. He had completely forgotten about this tragedy, which happened less than 2 months ago. The effect of the pills that were prescribed by the doctor did not take long. Already that evening, Michael felt much calmer. The worries caught up with him at the moment when Caroline flirted with him. Sometimes he wanted to sit in front of his wife and tell her everything. Would she understand? Wouldn't she turn away? He wasn't sure of an affirmative answer to those questions. So he decided to continue his tactic of complete silence. All this time, Caroline was going crazy, as she didn't understand what was happening. Sometimes her worries grew to such an extent that she began to follow her husband, that he was late at work, and that's why the girl had thoughts that he was cheating on her. But however, after several checks, she still came to the conclusion that he is completely loyal and faithful to her. But that did not explain that he had lost interest in his woman. She promised herself to find some explanation that would satisfy her interest and worries. The girl didn't like playing detective, but periodically she still continued to pick up Michael's phone to look at his correspondences. She supposed that the mistress didn't necessarily have to be from his work. Perhaps a woman from another city altogether. Each time the phone ended up in her hands, she found nothing. When Michael entered the room at those moments, Caroline felt very embarrassed. Caroline had often read in women's magazines and forums that when there was a rift in a family, the spouses would sit down across from each other and talk frankly. She had pictured this picture in her head several times. She could have asked Michael to sit down at the negotiating table, but this conversation had to start somewhere. Every time she broached the subject, the man would get nervous and walk away. How do you get him to sit, listen, much less answer questions? At some point, the girl thought about asking her husband to see a marriage counselor. In their relationship, there were no quarrels and scolding. They also continued to love each other. Caroline felt like a real woman, loved, happy, received gifts from her husband. However, the lack of attention and desire killed everything in this background. And maybe it was the psychologist who would help pull out of Michael the emotions he was hiding from her. "Michael, we need to talk to you," Caroline spoke softly as she entered the room where Michael lay watching television. "What's wrong, honey? You look worried, honey. Every time I try to talk to you about something, you always get nervous and walk away. I don't know how to approach you. I feel like you're not in love with me anymore. Or there's someone else. If you can't tell me all this, then maybe we can go to a family counselor," Caroline said timidly. "What family counselor, Caroline? Are you out of your mind? How could you even think that I had someone? That I've fallen out of love with you? I don't kiss you, I don't hug you, I don't give you gifts. I'm affectionate and gentle enough with you. I go home after work all the time. Can you please explain when I can cheat on you if I'm either working or with you? But you sometimes stay late at work, don't you?" "Yes, I sometimes stay late at work. Is that a sin? You know that I have always tried to earn as much money as possible for our family so that you stay at home doing your favorite things. Is that wrong? I'll be honest with you, if you keep having these conversations with me, then even a marriage counselor won't be able to help us. I understand men now more than anyone when they talk about their wives bothering them. Why do you talk to me like that? Why are you talking to me like that? Have I ever said anything bad about our family? I just want us to be okay. You're pretending like nothing happened, but I know how hard it must be for you. Yeah, from the outside looking in, we're fine. But I'm not looking from the outside. I'm in this family and I know there's a rift. I've tried to talk to you for the 1000th time, but I keep getting silence. I'm glad I can get some emotion out of you now. Even if it's anger, at least I realize that it's all pissing you off too. You care about what's between us. I can tell. But I don't understand why you're not doing anything about it. If it's really as you say and you don't have anyone on the side, I don't want to talk to you like this. You're forcing me to. If you know I'm hurt, why do you keep touching it? Can't you just wait? Any wound, whether it's on your body or your soul, takes time to heal. But if you keep poking it, it takes longer. I'm not stupid. I understand what's bothering you about our relationship. And since you wanted to talk to me, here you go. Can you give me just a little more time? I can't tell you how much. I realize that time is the most precious thing in our lives. But if you're not willing to give it to me, then we should break up. So you're telling me to get a divorce. So all that love you've been saying is a lie. God, how stupid I was to believe you. When I confessed my feelings to you when I was 14, I should have realized what kind of man you are. Jesus, what are you talking about? I'm only asking for a little time, Michael replied. Everything I've told you is true, but right now there's a chasm between us. Do you refuse to hear me? Michael asked, losing his temper. How many times are you going to remind me that I didn't take a little girl's words seriously back then? Caroline looked at him with her blue eyes. Tears streamed down her cheeks, blurring her mascara and eyeliner. A lump stood in her throat, preventing her from saying a word. She realized she'd gotten what she wanted. The conversation had happened, and she'd heard the words she'd dreamed of hearing. She was glad, however, that she had brought out his true emotions. His words were so sharp that they pierced her heart. Finding no more strength, Caroline turned around and ran out of the flat. Once outside, she didn't know where to go. Usually when she felt sick, she ran to Michael's house. Ignoring the people around her and her appearance, around the corner she saw the beautiful golden domes of a newly built church and was pulled there by an invisible force. Caroline had never been to church before and didn't know what to do, where to go, or where to put candles. But she headed there anyway. She had seen people baptized 3 times at the entrance to the church and decided to do the same. As she crossed the threshold, a woman stopped her. Honey, you can't do that. You have to cover your head. But I don't have anything. I didn't mean to come. I just felt the urge, Caroline said, barely audible. The woman nodded as if she understood. She knew how an unknown force led people to church to ask for help or to thank God. The woman went behind a small counter, pulled a headscarf from there, and held it out to Caroline. The girl tied it on her head and approached the icon. Lord, please help me to make things right with our family again. I love him more than life and I don't know how to live without him. Help him to heal his wounds. It's too hard for him and he can't do it on his own. I'd like to offer him my help, but I don't know how. He might refuse. Today was the first time we fought in years. I never thought it would be over something so petty. Although, to be honest, it's hardly nothing. There's just so much going on. I don't think we can do it without you. Please help me. I want to be happy and loved again. After standing for a moment, Caroline headed for the exit. She stopped beside the woman to hand over the headscarf, but the woman waved her hand, signaling that Caroline could keep it. She was grateful for the help, so she took out some cash and dropped it into the special donation box at the church. Caroline still didn't know where she should go, so she decided to head wherever her eyes took her. At this time, Michael was going crazy and wasn't himself for allowing the argument to happen. Yes, he and Caroline had been difficult at times, but they had always found a way out. And now she'd run away. He had no idea where to look for her because she'd left her phone at home. Michael thought the best option was to stay home. If he went outside to look for her, they might go in different directions and get lost. At that moment, Michael's phone rang with a courier who had brought him a parcel of supplements. If he had received this parcel at another time, he would have been happy. But now he didn't care about this drug, because he had a more serious problem in front of him, fixing his relationship with his wife. Michael left the small box in the hallway and went into the living room. Meanwhile, Caroline continued walking down the street. Her lack of outerwear had left her so cold that her fingers and toes were numb. She had no choice but to return home. Most of all, the girl hoped that Michael had come to his senses and would not be hysterical anymore. For the sake of their peace of mind, she was ready not to start such conversations, but just to wait. When she reached the front door of the flat, Caroline stopped and exhaled. She looked up as if to God. "Please let her calm down," she whispered under her breath. As she entered the hallway, Michael's hurried footsteps were heard. Seeing his wife on the threshold, the man exhaled with relief, rushed to her and hugged her tightly. His worries were so strong that he could not let her out of his embrace. They stood like that for several minutes without saying a word. "Caroline, honey, I'm so sorry, please. I don't know what came over me. I know, but I couldn't control my emotions. I'm going through the same thing you are. I'd really like things to get better. But I went to the doctor, and he said it takes time." "I apologize too, Michael. I realize that sometimes I overreact. I've tried to talk to you so many times. It's hard for me to process all of this inside of me. You said you went to the doctor. Why didn't you tell me anything?" "Well, maybe because I was ashamed. You didn't think about it. I'm a young man, and I can't do it." "Who would brag about that?" The doctor said we just have to wait. Caroline and Michael sat on the couch discussing a serious problem. "Isn't there any other option?" she asked Michael. In his opinion, the only solution was to wait, and if necessary, to take pills that had an immediate effect. "Have you taken these pills before? Maybe we could try them?" Caroline asked with hope in her voice. No, Caroline. Those pills won't have any effect. You have to be treated for your body to regain function. It's like a ventilator. Your body can't breathe. You're put on a ventilator that does it for you. Taking these pills that the doctor prescribed to me has exactly the same effect on the body. I don't want that. I want to feel like a man again. Love my beautiful woman night after night. Is that too much to ask?" Caroline realized that if this conversation didn't end now, they might have a fight. She had made a promise at church that she was willing to give her husband as much time as he needed. "Okay, I heard you. I'll wait as long as it takes. Can I just ask you one more question?" "Thank you, dear. I'm glad we could come to an agreement." "Go ahead." "There was nothing on the dresser when I left. What's this little box? Where did it come from?" When I left the doctor's office, I didn't believe what he said. I started searching the internet to find out the real cause of my condition. But on one of the sites I came across an advert for a male strength supplement. And at that moment, it seemed to me a super attractive offer. So, anyway, I ordered it. It arrived today while you were away. I'm anticipating your next question, so I'm going to answer it right away. No, I'm not going to take it. You see, it's just that it's been so long since the doctor's appointment that I've been able to accept what he said. I'm taking some other pills that I've been prescribed to calm me down. It should speed up the recovery process, Michael said. I heard you. Let me just hide it so it doesn't get in the way. Or maybe we could just throw it away. But why? Maybe we could give it to one of our friends as a joke. Caroline took the little box and carried it into the kitchen. On the way, she scrutinized it carefully, studying the composition and method of application. Even though Michael didn't want to take any more of it, Caroline decided that she knew better than he did what was best for him. If he didn't want to take care of his health, she would take care of it herself. In her opinion, the supplement could not bring any negative consequences, so there was nothing to be afraid of using it. Opening the bottle, Caroline smelled a pungent herbal odor. The girl thought that it would not be possible to simply add these drops to food. She had to think of something tricky. The best way to do this was flavored tea. She could add the dietary supplement to the drink without Michael noticing. Caroline didn't want to wait for the right moment and decided to act right away. She went to the kitchen cupboard, opened it, and began studying all the teas they had. She needed to find one that had the most pungent odor. She found a mango-flavored tea. Caroline knew that Michael loved a drink with that flavor more than anything else in his life, so the girl needed to make a separate tea for herself. She brewed her favorite bergamot tea in one of the beautiful mugs she had recently bought at the mall. For Michael, on the other hand, she made mango tea in a teapot. She had to be careful not to let her spouse walk in at that moment. Quietly looking around, Caroline pulled out a small vial of herbal drops for male power. As she was measuring the right amount of drops into the kettle, the vial fell out of her hands and she poured about a third of the entire volume of the supplement into the kettle. At first she was afraid that she might overdose, but then she remembered that the drug had a natural composition, which meant that it couldn't do anything bad for a person. Caroline didn't pay much attention to what she had done. She tried to catch the aroma from the drink and realized that she could only smell mango. The girl was satisfied with this result and took the drinks to the living room, where Michael was waiting for her. The young man was a little surprised when he caught the aroma of familiar tea. Caroline hadn't asked him before if he wanted tea. "I decided that after today we needed to calm down," Caroline said with a sweet smile. "So I made our favorite teas. I made bergamot for myself as always, and I picked out a mango one for you. Do you want me to get you something for your tea?" "The only thing I want for tea is for you to be with me right now," Michael said warmly, pouring tea into a mug. Caroline watched him as if mesmerized. She decided that her only mistake had been in not tasting the drink. It might not have smelled different, but the taste might have given away her devious plan. To her delight, Michael hadn't noticed anything. Caroline hoped that a larger dose of the drug would speed up its effects. Periodically she looked at Michael but realized that nothing was working. Then the girl moved to active actions, began stroking and kissing her lover. However, it was obvious that he was not happy about this behavior. Completely desperate, Caroline went to the bedroom to get ready for sleep. Half an hour later, Michael came into the bedroom. He lay down in his seat. Everything was as it always was. It took Michael literally minutes to fall asleep while Caroline twisted around and couldn't find a comfortable position. When she did get comfortable, she couldn't fall asleep. Her head was filled with thoughts that kept her awake. From time to time, she looked at her husband. She loved him with all her heart and soul and wanted everything to return to normal as soon as possible. While Caroline sank into the realm of Morpheus, she dreamed wonderful good dreams. It was times like these that she truly rested in the dream realm. Their relationship with Michael was still good as before. The young man loved his spouse, cared for her, protected her. Caroline dreamed that they were with her husband on a yacht. A light sea breeze, the salty taste of the sea appeared in her mouth. Everything was so beautiful. However, even in her dream, Caroline realized that it would soon be over. Through the dream, she heard that Michael began to cough. When she opened her eyes, she saw that her husband was grabbing his throat, coughing and moaning. It seemed to her that he was still asleep, so she decided to wake him up. As soon as she touched his body, the man opened his eyes abruptly. The whites were completely red, with burst vessels. The coughing was getting worse by the minute. Caroline quickly jumped out of bed and ran to the kitchen to fill a glass of water. When she entered the bedroom, she saw that Michael was already beginning to choke. She sat down next to him, put her arms around him, and held out the glass, but he knocked it out of her hands. As much as Caroline wanted to help him, she realized she couldn't. Then she immediately ran around the flat to find her mobile phone and call an ambulance. There was no way she could help Michael because she didn't understand what was happening to him. She could only hope and trust that the medical team would arrive within minutes. Michael's breathing was getting heavier. With each passing minute, his face began to take on a purplish-blue hue. The panic inside Caroline was beginning to rise. However, at that moment, the intercom rang. It was an ambulance. The paramedics quickly entered the flat and went to Michael's flat. The crew stood in the doorway and watched them examine him. Almost immediately, they said it was a swelling of the larynx that was caused by allergies. Caroline was in shock at this diagnosis, because she and Michael had never noticed any signs of allergies in him before. The paramedic gave him a few shots, and then they loaded the young man into the ambulance and took him to the hospital. Caroline went with them. She could not leave her favorite man alone in such a difficult situation. The young man was immediately taken away. At that moment, a doctor came into the corridor who wanted to talk to Caroline. "Hello, I need to ask you some questions," the doctor asked in a calm voice. "Can you please tell me what your husband is allergic to?" "Good evening. I can't answer that question because nothing like this has ever happened to him before." This is the first time, Caroline said, shifting from foot to foot. "Well then, think about it and tell me, what was the most unusual thing you've consumed today? Or maybe you changed a new laundry detergent." The doctor kept asking questions. No, it's the same. I can't tell you that we had any unusual meals. Everything he ate today he's eaten before. All right, what about drinks? Did he drink any alcohol today? You know, sometimes a reaction like that can be triggered by red wine. No, nothing like that. I would have told you about it. Doctor, can you please tell me if he's feeling better? Caroline asked. I can't answer that question with certainty yet, replied the doctor. The thing is that you called the ambulance late enough, so your husband is now in a serious condition. They are giving him hot shots in the treatment room. They're supposed to make him feel much better. If the swelling doesn't go down, then we'll try inhalation. But I've heard many times that inhalation is not to be used because it's addictive, Caroline objected. So you're suggesting I don't use it and wait for your husband to die? Why die right away? You said he should feel better after the injections. Caroline didn't calm down. If the swelling doesn't go down, then maybe we should give him more shots. She'd heard repeatedly that inhalations were addictive. Caroline didn't want her spouse to live a life of dependency. You see, there's a certain dosage that allows for these injections. If we increase it, we could overdose. And then against the background of oedema of the larynx, your husband may develop other symptoms, explained the doctor. And all of this together could hasten his demise. Is that what you're trying to do? How can you think that of me? If I wanted him to die, I wouldn't have called an ambulance, Caroline said indignantly. And why are you acting like this anyway? You're a doctor, you're supposed to calm people down. I say that because you are trying to oppose the use of inhalation, replied the doctor. Yes, I am a doctor, but I should not reassure anyone. I should tell the truth. If I tell you that everything will be fine and your spouse ends up dead, you will blame me. And why would you blame me? Because I spent all this time with my colleagues pulling him out of the woods and I couldn't? Please keep your emotions to yourself and go home. If you want to stay here, shut your mouth and keep quiet. It was not uncommon for a doctor to encounter such patients and their relatives. However, he could not develop immunity to such communication during all the years of his work. After this conversation, the man turned around and went to the treatment room where Michael was. Caroline stayed that way in the corridor. She felt that the doctor was wrong in having the right to talk to her like that. His words had crashed into her ears, and now she was constantly thinking about the fact that the risk of Michael dying was pretty high. The hot shots, as the doctor had suggested, had not helped Michael. In addition, inhalation did not have the desired effect. The doctors decided to transfer the young man to the intensive care unit under IVs. Caroline was horrified by such news. When her husband Michael was taken to the intensive care unit on a gurney, she ran after him. However, no matter how hard she tried, she was not allowed inside. All her attempts were in vain, and she was left in the corridor. It was one of the hardest times for Caroline. She couldn't understand what was causing such an allergic reaction. Their meals were no different than before. She didn't use any new cleaning or laundry products, so all possible causes ran out in her mind. She had once read on the internet that as a person gets older, they can develop allergies to pets. However, there were no pets at their home. The girl did not go home, but kept waiting in the hospital for good news. She was sure that her husband would survive and be with her. She refused in every way to believe in the high risk of a fatal outcome. At first, the doctors and nurses tried to persuade her to go home. However, when they realized it was useless, they passed her by as if she was not there. This attitude made it even harder for Caroline. Throughout her life, doctors had always been angels in white coats to her. However, now she faced a completely different attitude to patients and their relatives. The girl wanted to go to complain to the head doctor, but halfway down the road she stopped and thought that perhaps the medical staff was not obliged to reassure her and give her false hopes. On the second day, Caroline still had not received any news about the improvement of her husband's condition. She continued to push for news and spend the night in the corridor. At some point, the thought crept into her head that perhaps she was to blame for her lover's condition. She remembered the drug she had mistakenly put in his tea. Perhaps that was what had caused such an allergic reaction. Given that the dosage had been exceeded several times over, the likelihood of an allergic reaction was increasing. The feeling of guilt did not leave Caroline throughout Michael's treatment. After a few days, the young man felt better. After a while, he was moved to a regular room. Caroline was overjoyed at this news and couldn't believe that he had managed to recover. Immediately after that, she headed to her lover's room. When she entered the ward, she found that he was not lying there alone. Besides him, there were 5 other men there. It was clear from Michael's face that he did not feel very well, but his eyes showed his true joy for finally seeing his beloved woman. He didn't really fully understand what was happening to him as he had spent most of the time unconscious. "Caroline, sweetheart, hello. It's really good to see you. Can you tell me what happened to me? I haven't seen a doctor yet today, but the nurses won't tell me anything. I realize I've been unconscious most of the time. You can't imagine the dreams I've had during that time. They were very strange dreams. Walking down some kind of pipe and going through some kind of tunnel. And the interesting thing is, I kept thinking I'd see you when I finished. But it was like I couldn't find you anywhere. Seriously, no matter how hard I looked for you, you were nowhere to be found. I realized even then that this wasn't just a dream, and in theory you should appear. But it's like you just fell into the ground. Oh, it's so good to see you. You have no idea how much I've been worried about you. I've been in the hospital all these days, never went home. I slept in the corridor. The doctors say you had an acute allergic reaction with swelling of the larynx. They asked me a lot of questions about what had changed in our normal life. I told them everything was the same. I don't understand what could have done that, Caroline said in a quiet, loving voice. She was ashamed to admit that it was her fault that her husband had almost died. She decided not to tell him about it. It's strange, I've never had allergies in my entire life. You know, I read on the internet once that you can get allergies as you get older, but it was more about allergies to cats and dogs. We don't have those. Or maybe you were at someone's house that day who has pets. The girl kept lying. Yeah, I wasn't at anyone's house. It's weird. You'll have to take special tests right after your discharge to get your allergies out. It'll help keep me out of these situations in the future. Michael was on the mend. Caroline still continued to spend the night at the hospital. She was already comfortable leaving him alone, but she couldn't afford to come to their house alone. Everything around her would remind her of the day she had made the fatal mistake. The young man was discharged after about a fortnight. During this time, he had lost a lot of weight because he had special nutrition. This was necessary so as not to cause another seizure. After the youngster returned home, Michael immediately took sick leave from work. He needed some time to recover. Caroline was all over him, trying to please him in every way. Her guilt never left her, but grew every day. She feared more than anything that her beloved husband would find out that it was all her fault. To prevent him from having such thoughts, the girl constantly pampered him with various goodies. Every day they spent all the time together. The first few days they did not leave the house at all, lying on the sofa, watching TV, playing board games. Things went back to normal. Caroline was glad that things were back to normal between them. One day, Michael decided to surprise his beloved and cook breakfast in bed. Returning an hour earlier than his wife, he went to the kitchen. He then wanted to treat Caroline with delicious pancakes and fresh coffee with jam. Michael started exploring the kitchen looking for all the necessary ingredients. He really didn't know very well where everything was, because Caroline didn't let him anywhere near her territory. She thought that a man had no business being in the kitchen if his wife didn't work and was a housewife. When the necessary ingredients for the pancakes were found, the man started cooking. Several times he cursed loudly because the pancakes did not want to separate from the pan at all. He never understood how the cooks were so good at flipping pancakes without even touching them. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't do it. In addition, Michael could not adjust the fire on the cooker. Pancakes burned or did not reach. Despite the failures, Michael still managed to make an impressive stack of pancakes. He thought it was an impossible task, which he managed. Yes, the pancakes were thicker than his wife's, but it was the first time he had ever cooked them. The products were lying on a beautiful plate near the window, and the sunlight was falling on them. At that moment, Michael felt like decorating breakfast. The young man opened one of the cupboards, which he thought should contain all the syrups and additives for desserts. There were indeed a great many bottles there. However, most of the names were either in a foreign language or erased. He felt a little uneasy when he saw a small vial of male strength supplements among all those bottles. He was somehow sure earlier that Caroline had thrown it away because he had asked for it. But despite that, the vial was still standing. and then Michael picked it up and found that a third of the volume inside was gone. He was surprised by this, as he couldn't understand where Caroline could have used the supplement. The initial thought that popped into his head was that his spouse had a lover. That thought left as quickly as it came to Michael. The young man thought that if it were true, Caroline wouldn't complain about the lack of intimacy. Michael stashed the vial in his pocket so he could ask his wife questions after breakfast and then started brewing coffee. When everything was ready, he loaded the pancakes and 2 cups of coffee onto a special tray and carried them into the bedroom. When he opened the door, he found Caroline still asleep. He thought about the fact that the girl must have been very tired during all those weeks living in the hospital. She, unlike the patients, was not provided with a separate bed and had to sleep either sitting up or curled up on the narrow benches. It was obvious from her face that she was enjoying her sleep. Michael noted how beautiful she was, so much so that he didn't want to wake her. Despite this, however, the young man walked over to the bed, placed the tray on the bedside table, and leaned over to his beloved. Hugging her tightly, he began to whisper affectionate words in her ear. It wasn't clear whether Caroline was awake or not. However, the corners of her lips lifted up slightly, creating a beautiful smile. When Caroline woke up, opening her eyes, she saw her husband, her lips stretched in a wide smile. She moved slightly so Michael could lie down next to her. The young man could not resist such an offer, so he immediately gave in to the entreaties. The girl enclosed her lover in an embrace and reached for him with her plump lips. The man did not leave Caroline without a morning portion of caresses and began to reciprocate. At some point, Michael realized that Caroline wanted more from him. However, he wasn't ready for that yet. It was at that moment that he decided to stop her and tell her what he had made for breakfast. "I made the pancakes myself," Michael said. "I can't believe it. In all these years, you've never made me anything. How did you do that?" Caroline asked excitedly. "Well, of course I've never cooked before. You never let me go anywhere. Remember, I've tried to make us dinner or lunch many times, and you've always said I'll do it myself, and I've loved cooking since I was a kid. But for some reason, you clung to that kitchen and you weren't ready to give it to someone else. To be honest, sometimes it was so frustrating that it seemed to me that I was not your favorite person at all, but some stranger." "Why do you say that? On the contrary, I always wanted to take care of you. You'd come home from work tired, you had a lot of big orders, after which I realized that you didn't want to do anything. And you'd rush into the kitchen to make dinner. How could I let that happen? I'm a housewife, so I have to do everything myself. It's precisely because cooking calms me down. I'm chopping something up, slow cooking on the cooker. With each clatter of the knife against the board, it's as if the anger is released and the fatigue goes away. I didn't understand what you wanted, what was best. I tried to tell you that it wasn't hard for me, but you wouldn't hear me. For some reason you got it into your head that I was tired, and therefore I should lie on the sofa." For a few more minutes, the young people argued among themselves about who should cook. Despite the fact that Caroline was completely against Michael going near her kitchen, she did tell him that she would give him her space a few times a month to make them happy with a delicious meal. After that, the young ones proceeded to breakfast. When Caroline put the pancake her husband had prepared into her mouth, she melted with pleasure. It was so soft and buttery that she didn't need to chew it at all. It melted in her mouth. When she decided to drink it with coffee, she mixed up the mugs. She never drank hot drinks with sugar, because she thought that sweeteners spoilt the flavor of the drink. So when she took a sip from Michael's mug, she immediately blinked as if she had eaten a slice of lemon. At that moment, Michael laughed. It seemed to Caroline that this was one of the best days of her life. In her opinion, she and Michael had never been able to spend so much time together. They were devoted to each other. When breakfast was over, Michael decided to ask his beloved a few questions. "Sweetheart," he said, "I realize this isn't a good time, but you know I can't wait until tonight or tomorrow." "What's wrong?" Caroline sounded worried. She immediately began to go over in her head the points at which Michael could be having a serious conversation. However, nothing had happened recently. "You see, I was making breakfast today, and I didn't know where all the groceries were," Michael explained. "So I must have searched all the cupboards. And when I opened the cupboard where the syrup should be, I saw this." He handed Caroline a small vial of the male enhancement product. "I noticed that there's about a third of it missing," Michael continued. You may not want to talk about it, but I can't live with the idea that you're somehow taking this stuff. First of all, I'm curious. And secondly, I'm worried. I don't know, Caroline replied. Maybe the lid was loose, and it was spilling out. I didn't touch it. When you told me to put it away, I put it in the cabinet. Caroline couldn't stop twiddling her fingers and biting her lower lip. She realized her spouse could see her anxiety and panic, but despite that, she continued to lie to him so he wouldn't know the truth. But I can see that you're not telling me something, Michael said. Tell me honestly, do you have a lover? That's the only explanation I can think of. I would never have thought you could have someone on the side. But with the way things have been going lately, I can understand that. So I'm asking you to be honest with me. What lover? Caroline exclaimed. Are you out of your mind? That's why I've been hitting on you every night. Do you have an ounce of conscience? No one could ever love you as much as I do. There's never been another man in my life but you. When you and I got married, all my friends told me I was doing it for nothing. They said I didn't try other men, and then I'd go out with other men. But I don't want other men. I just want you, you know. Okay. I'm sorry, Michael said. I didn't think it would hurt you that much, Michael said. I just asked the question with the first thought that came into my head. Then I thought it couldn't be, but I decided to make sure I was right anyway. Then tell me, where did the drug go? You couldn't have taken it yourself. I couldn't. That's why you drank it, Caroline said with a serious face. Why are you looking at me like that? What am I, your enemy? I'll tell you how it happened. But if you start getting angry like you always do, I'll just turn around and walk away. Do you understand? At that moment, Michael nodded his head slightly. It's because we don't have a sex life, Caroline continued. I completely understand that you're stressed, but I don't like the fact that you're not doing anything about it. You've had a doctor prescribe pills and you refused them because it was beneath your dignity. And you only thought of yourself then. Who's going to think about me? When I came home and saw that bottle, I didn't realize what it was. But when you told me it was special for male strength, I was glad in my heart. I thought, well, at least you're going to do something about it now, right? I was wrong. And this time you told me to just throw the bottle away because you changed your mind. You didn't try it and you changed your mind. And I decided that this time I would think for you. Michael listened to his wife with his mouth open. He couldn't believe that she could do such a thing. After all, this is not just some joke. Although the drug is safe, it still has contraindications. How can you put someone on medication without consulting a doctor? And I thought I decided that you should take the drug, Caroline said. I was making your favorite mango tea and I wanted to measure out a few drops of the drug. But it fell out, and a large amount spilled out. I was hesitating whether to carry it or not. Then I looked at the packaging, read that it was all natural, and decided that it wouldn't do any harm. And yes, Michael, it's my fault you spent a lot of time in intensive care. I'm the reason you got allergies. Tears began to pool in Caroline's eyes and she began to sob. I wanted what was best for you. You know, I'm tired. Okay, we don't have intimacy, but you don't even hug me or kiss me. It's so rare. It always makes me want to cry. I didn't think it would be like this. You never told me you had any allergies. And these are pretty popular, common ingredients. You can't be allergic to ginger. You love ginger biscuits. You think all the days I spent in the hospital with you. I didn't think about it. Caroline said. My guilt always haunted me. I cried. I prayed to God that you'd come out of it. I didn't want to tell you right away that it was my fault. I thought I'd tell you later when you'd recovered. But today you wanted to make these pancakes for some reason. Caroline started to get hysterical. Michael could not look at her in such a state, so he immediately rushed to his beloved and put her in a tight embrace. He understood where the drug had gone and realized that she hadn't done it out of spite. She wanted love and harmony to be restored to their family. It was partly his fault, too. He kept hugging her, kissing her, whispering affectionate words in her ear. When the girl calmed down a little, he told her that he held no grudge against her. He promised that he would go to another doctor who would help him prescribe a new treatment. Michael kept all his promises, and within 3 months their lives were back on track. Caroline felt elated again. Every day she thanked God that she and Michael had made it through this difficult time in their lives.